Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto was primordial god in danmachi. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by Dreaming of Swords and link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. Prologue. The beginning. Let me tell you a story. A tale about a boy, a child, a young man whose dream was to be a hero. He was a peculiar boy, an energetic lad, hyperactive yet curious about every little thing he ever saw. He was visually very different from everyone due to his strikingly white hair and red eyes, but that's what made him so unique. He was bright, ethereal to a degree, he was unlike any other I have ever seen in my long life, but that could be attributed to his unique heritage. The child loved a lot of things, but the most joy he found was in my own handwritten storybooks about the heroes of old, the heroes of myth that attained their status through hard work and deathly adventures. Those were his favorite. He loved the story about Hercules and his 12 labors, about how the great Theseus laid the Minotaur, and even the story of Perseus and his battle against Medusa. The boy loved those stories and never grew tired of listening to their tales, not once. The exuberance in his eyes as he read those stories over and over again told me all I needed to know. The boy had gained a dream. When I asked him what he wanted to be, he answered in the only manner I knew he would. I want to be like them, Grandpa. I want to be strong, I want to be a hero. That was his answer, an answer filled with all the childlike enthusiasm and innocence expected from a boy his age. However, unlike other children, he truly stuck to those words, and he went out on his first adventure into the woods outside our village. He got lost of course, and I found him after a while and was about to admonish his behavior and his reckless endangerment of himself. That is until I found the boy crying a good few meters away. Now that wasn't at all that surprising, but what was the corpse of a clearly dead wild kobold at the boy's feet. Now, you have to imagine my surprise. No adventurers had been in the area at the time, it was only my grandson. There had been no protectors from our village either in the vicinity. So, this left me with only one conclusion, something that left me feeling something I haven't felt since I found the boy as a newborn. Excitement. My grandson, a boy of only 4 years of age, had somehow or someway killed a kobold, and the way it died was a feat in of itself. Its body had been scorched and was still burning in flames. But not like any other flame, it was flames I was all too familiar with, they were the very flames of hell itself. Wielded only by the goddess of the sun, Amaterasu, and all those affiliated by her flames, but I knew the boy hadn't been touched by Amaterasu, so what was it? What caused it? I wasn't exactly sure myself. But I was sure of one thing, it had something to do with the boy's unique heritage. I made sure the boy never knew of this one simple fact, but the fact was the boy didn't have normal parents like any other human child. The boy was in fact a miraculous existence in of itself, he was a born conundrum that questioned everything I've ever known. His existence was a secret to all of the known world, something I made sure kept hidden away from even my own kind. Cause you see, the boy was not of this world. Now before you go and disregard this as an old man's rambling, let me explain, the boy isn't a part of this world, because I found or more in fact felt his existence left astray in the cosmos. Being an existence that I am, I was able to feel throughout the galaxy, and I felt the boy's presence in the vast sea of stars. And so I traveled and found him in a derelict vessel of some sort, beyond any ability to salvage, but it was in that ship I found the boy. He was but a fresh newborn wrapped up in silk wrappings of strange dialect design and other objects that I have kept to this day. I know not nor have I fully learned of what that dialect means, but I have kept it secret from everyone including the boy, as I knew from my own experience that such strange incidents have caused great conflicts amongst those of my kind. Which is why I have hidden the boy from their eyes. He was only a fresh newborn babe and deserved to live his own life. Only when he reached of age would I feel the need to give him what was rightfully his birthright. Still, with that fact coming back to remind me that this was no normal child, this left me pondering about the boy. Even after that incident he still pushed himself to be strong, he was adventurous for one so young, and because of that I decided to give him a little push in the direction he wanted. It was purely on a whim really, a sliver of excitement I hadn't felt since I first found him drifting among those stars, but it was that which urged me on to give the boy that one little push just to see what kind of path lay before him. That little push was me teaching him how to unlock the energy within him. I was able to decipher a few things from the belongings with the child, the first being the boy's name, which was oddly similar to the language used in the eastern lands of the earth. And the other was the fact that the boy held an energy that was very much like my own kind. It was the aspect of the two energies that I have come to know as physical energy and spiritual energy combined to create one universal energy that sung across the cosmos. It was the very energy of every living thing in existence, gods themselves were no exception to this fact. There just hadn't been a name for it until I was able to decipher it from what was found with the boy himself. Humans and other races with God's grace on this planet could use energy but was only able to utilize the spiritual half called mana, so this energy was in of itself unique and exciting to me. So I had him unlock it to release the energy that gods themselves were physical manifestations of, and that was chakra. If the depth of one's mana was how one could measure the potential one had, then what I had felt from the boy when he managed to unlock his chakra was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. It had sent my mind boggling when he broke the lock on his power he was born with. It had made my own celestial being resonate with his chakra. The resulting backlash had been utterly massive, and if I hadn't knocked out the boy, I was sure it would have alerted the other gods to his presence. Never before had I ever been so outright terrified and yet so thrilled as well from seeing so much potential in such a young soul. Still I saw it, for a moment I truly saw the kind of path the boy wanted to walk, the road he would travel. It would be a road filled with incredible hardship, one that would break anyone else, but it would be one filled with adventure, one filled with all sorts of battles and people that he would come to call friends, and even more so for others. It was a road he would forge for himself, a road that would define a generation, a road that would ultimately bring great change to both the heavens and the earth. At that moment, any shred of doubt I had for the boy was wiped clean. I knew he would become something great. I could see it every time I looked at him. He would become just like those heroes he admired so much and much more. He was filled with so much passion, so much spirit that I could not help but support him. Because I knew, as his grandfather and as one of the elder gods, I knew without a doubt he would become the greatest hero to ever walk the earth, the shining star that would surpass the heavens itself. Oh whoa. The darkness greeted him like a long-lost friend, and as he opened his eyes, it was lifted as if a veil had been torn from him. Recognition and familiarity lit up in his gaze as he looked upon his surroundings with a nostalgic expression. I'm here again. He knew this place. How could he not? This was where he was raised by his grandfather. It was a small humble little village outside the Labyrinth city of Arario, a village like many others meant for those with skills for farming and the cultivation of foods and resources. It was a village of poverty, one barely protected by the adventurers of Arario, yet one of the few that provided the largest amount of resources to the city. He stood there, amongst a village that was as silent a graveyard, which in all honesty it was. It was nighttime in this little whimsical memory of his, but one he would not soon forget. Turning his gaze to the left, his eyes fell upon the lands left untouched by the villagers so far, the same lands that were a bit a ways from the village itself. The grassy fields of his village were always something to be admired. It was his favorite spot as a child. When he was done with his chores for the day, he always ran toward those ever-stretching fields, laughing, playing and having the time of his young life. It was what kept him up in high spirit from the way he lived. He was a child of poverty, there was no denying this fact. He knew nothing else than that lifestyle. It was harsh, almost unforgiving at times, but in the end it taught him more about life and to how treasure every second of it. Living as a child with no parents and only his grandfather to raise him and teach him, he learned early on how to till the land, grow your own food, build your own home. He couldn't remember his parents as it was said they died when he was young, but he didn't care, he had his grandfather. It was him who taught him all he knew today, how to cherish every second of life he had. It was because of him that he walked down the path he was on this very day. Though he only started down that path on his 7th birthday when his grandfather died. It was said he had been chased by a monster and fell down a ravine. Such a drop was too much for anyone, and it was recorded he died. He remembered that event clearly. It was the day he lost the only thing left tying him to this world. His grandfather had been his only family he had left, and with him gone, he was left alone in the world. Yet he couldn't allow himself to cry in front of anyone, only in the solace of his home would he allow himself that luxury. However, he still remembered his grandfather's words before he left that day, the same words he kept remembering since he started his adventure. Every beginning starts at a humble one, just like when a newborn makes their first steps for the first time, an adventurer should make his first step something to remember. Make your adventure worthwhile, become strong and make your own tale worth remembering. Become the strongest, the brightest of them all, and only when you stand at the top should you share that light with those close to you. Those were the words he lived by to this very day. It was his code, the saying that made him keep going despite the odds he faced. Even if his body was broken, beaten and torn, he would stand up and keep walking forward to that dream, that goal. Even when others would shy away in the face of his presence, even as he steeped himself in an ocean of blood and death, he was satisfied if he could come back home to see the face of his new family. The world of his memories around him shimmered and broke apart like a wave crashing against a rocky shore, and what greeted him next was a sight that pushed away the darkness festering in his soul. It was the faces of those he wanted to protect the most. The very same people who were the reasons as to why he pushed himself like he did time and time and time again. Never faltering, never surrendering, they were his motivation, his reason to live, and for them he would conquer anything that stood in his path. Yeah, the young man told himself as the faces of his loved ones gathered before him. They were his dream now. Becoming a hero is all well and good, but if you don't have a reason, a purpose to become one, then it all becomes a monumental waste of effort. He spoke from experience. He knew this better than anyone else. Ever since he started his adventure, he never stopped pushing himself. Even when his body was beaten and broken, he never stopped. He wanted to become strong, stronger than anyone. It was why after his grandfather died, he moved to Arario and threw himself into the labyrinth of Arario, with little more than the clothes on his back and a knife in hand. Strength is what made you stand out amongst the norm, and due to his small stature, he was written off by most of the familia in Arario. But he never let that discourage him. In fact, it was what drove him into those suicidal runs into the dungeon every day. There was pain, oh so much pain when he began, but the pain mattered little to the mental sorrow he suffered every waking moment of his life. He was alone in the world, he had no one to come home to, no one to call his family anymore. He lived a lonely existence that he covered up with his drive to become strong. He closed off his heart, his soul to the world, and became nothing more than a machine without a purpose. But then he found a purpose, the light that shattered the darkness of his soul. She had been the first of a few, but she was the first one. His most beloved light, she was the one who gave him a chance where others turned their backs on him. She gave him something he could never repay. She, a goddess, had given him the chance to be the first of her familia. Her family. He could never repay such compassion, and in the end he accepted with the duty of supporting himself and his goddess. She gave him a chance, and in turn he would make sure her decision wasn't wasted on him. Despite her saying otherwise, she became his first light, and with it a purpose for him to become a hero he so dreamed to become. She was the first, but not the last. For them, for all of them, I will become their hero. As his thoughts waned on his purpose, his resolve strengthened as he looked upon the additional faces of those he had came to know since he started his adventure when he was only 7 years old. Their smiles, their encouragement, they were his purpose, his drive to become strong. But among those faces another appeared, one that shined just as brightly as the others. But her face escaped him, all that he knew was her long gold hair and golden eyes. "Who are you?" he questioned, though it was left unanswered, her face was familiar to him. It reminded him of the days of when he first began his adventure, but he was not sure why. That long flowing golden hair and those orbs of liquid gold was strikingly familiar to him, and yet he could not fathom as to why. Why did this person's face make him feel uneasy? As if he had forgotten something. However, there was something else lurking behind those faces, something dwelling in the darkness. He wasn't sure what, but it was always there when he awoke to these memories of his. It was a dark and hollow feeling he felt, but among everyone, even of his grandfather, he felt something was amiss. Something was in that darkness of his, waiting, festering within his soul, just waiting to come out at any given moment of his own weakness. I know this feeling, he did. He had known about it for as long as he could remember. One secret he had kept from even his grandfather, the one thing that had come along with him when he unlocked his natural-born power. The sentient entity that latched onto his soul like a leech and fed upon his own darkness. Even now he could feel it, writhing around, moving in accordance to his own thoughts. As if to scorn him and his existence, reminding him that he was not human, that he was an existence that was much more yet much less than a human. He was a monster. But his thoughts were left unattended once again as the darkness came back, swallowing up his world in a never-ending tsunami of ebony. Consuming what light he had built up within his soul, and with it his eyes closed to the eternal night. His body surrendered to the nigh omnipotent force of the blackness, and he let his body still as he let his mind drift away once again. Amongst the inky black waves that threatened to consume his entire being, and yet it embraced him like a long-lost friend. Oh whoa. Warmth was the first thing he felt upon returning to the land of the living. The steady beat of his heart was the first sign that he was alive. Then he felt for his surroundings, an instinctual habit if nothing else, and he relaxed when he felt the familiar feeling of his bedroom. His body adjusted to his worn-out lumpy couch, the springs punching into his back. Mildly discomforting, but nothing he had grown used to. However, once he regained motor function of his body again, he became well aware of something else. There was a weight on top of him, a distinctly smaller body than his own, and one he was all too familiar with. Upon opening his eyes, orbs of the purest crimson pierced through the darkness, and they looked down to see another person sleeping with him. Pulling the cover over him off slightly, he was unsurprised to see it was a young-looking girl that appeared to be his age. She had long silky black hair and a fair complexion. If her eyes were open, one would have been greeted by the sight of the deepest blue one would ever have the honor of seeing. The young girl in question was dressed only in a light blue tank top and panties. The clothing only accentuated a robust bosom, wide hips and tight buttocks, a contradictory to her rather young appearance. If he was younger he would have been affected by this show of flesh and display of affection from this girl, but he had grown accustomed to it and on some level welcomed it. After all, her appearance could be deceiving to many as she was in fact a goddess, one of many that resides in the lower world. She was his goddess, his most cherished person, the one who saved him and in turn, he vowed to protect with all his might. Hestia-sama, that was the name of his goddess, one that had the appearance of a teenager, but was in fact a transcendent existence in her own right. While not as well known as other gods and goddesses, she was still one to be respected. He respected her but also took care of her when she got in over her head on certain matters, as he had learned early on when he joined her that she always seemed to get in trouble. She was a glutton, clumsy, hyperactive as he was when he was a child, and was always finding ways to steep herself in debt with her fellow deities. He remembered on a few occasions having to spend his entire sum to get her out of trouble with them, with the risk of revealing himself to the other deities as well. But with his dungeon runs on his own, he was recently able to completely get her out of the debt she put herself in with the other gods. How she could put herself in a 200 million volley debt was through a series of events before she met him 8 years ago. But he wouldn't have wanted her any other way. Running his hand through her long black tresses with all the tenderness acquired from years of being under Hestia's affection and compassion. The young man allowed a small smile to grace his features as he stared down at the girl. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth and family and treated him with so much compassion when she first found him that he had been balked by her generosity. In his mind, he could never repay her, which is why he dutifully vowed to always be at her side when she always needed it. Be that against other familias or the other deities themselves, he would stand at her side and slay anyone that stood to oppose or oppress her. He was her sword and shield, to be used how she pleased. That was his vow to her as the only familia dependent she had. He understood her position with the other deities and made sure she understood he would be at her side, regardless of what others may think or say. Yes, let them come. His eyes burned at the notion of conflict with the other familia, while he and Hestia were on good terms with a few familias that worked for their keep. The same couldn't be said for those that stood at the higher echelon that looked down on the others. He remembered perfectly well on those that looked down on him when he first arrived in Arario. Now that he was older, stronger than he could have ever dreamed of becoming, he stood ready to oppose them or anyone for Hestia. Feeling her hum against his touch, he felt her sink even more into his body, and he let out a sigh. Shaking his head, he turned to look up at the window, and, seeing the midnight sky made him narrow his eyes. From his view of the sky, it had just reached midnight, meaning most of the occupants in Arario were fast asleep, which was his time to get started on his nightly activities. There was a reason his existence was a mystery to the other deities in Arario, and more to the other familia. He knew of his unique status when Hestia bestowed upon him her grace. A secret shared only between him and her and no one else, and that was the fact that he had a unique ability that, if found out by others, would cause a massive conflict with the other familias. And that was one of his inherent skills called realist phrase. It was a rare skill that Hestia said was the first of its kind. It was a single-minded pursuit ability that enhanced the speed of growth to the user as long as his or her feelings for the one who awakened the ability lasted. It's what enabled him to grow so quickly, as it was Hestia who awakened that ability the first time they met. At first he didn't understand as to what it meant, and Hestia didn't let a single moment pass her by where she didn't tease him about it. Yet over time he began to understand what it meant, and least to say he wasn't the least bit troubled by it. But there in itself was a problem. He grew too fast for a human, and to protect himself, he conjured a facade of a shy, inexperienced boy for the citizens of Arario to underestimate. Yet underneath that exterior was someone else, something else that was far too dangerous to be kept alive in the eyes of the other gods if it was known publicly. It was a double life he lived, but it was for the safety of Hestia and those he cared for. It was to protect them from those that would seek to harm anyone that was close to him. Which was why he chose the split facade in the first place, to throw off his enemies. But there is more to this, of that I am sure. He thought about that, even with the realist phrase making his growth speed far faster than most, it couldn't fully explain everything else that made him distinctly different from everyone else. He'd known he was different from most others the moment his grandfather unlocked his power when he was 4 years old. What that power was, he wasn't sure of, but it was very different from others since it was something of his own inherent body instead of something gifted by the god's grace. After that power was unlocked, he became aware of other skills and abilities he was made wary of through his adventures, but it got stranger as they couldn't be recorded by Hestia's grace. Abilities that weren't gifted by its blessing but were similar to skills he inherited on his own and not by the fauna, which was powered by the blessing of the god or goddess. Which was impossible since without a deity's blessing humans or other races were not able to efficiently use their inherent abilities as effectively, if at all. His in particular were a wide range of skills and congenital magic abilities that were far too abnormal to be listed among the modern terminology of other skills and magic abilities. Even Hestia was a bit freaked when he mentioned it to her, which was why he kept those particular abilities to himself and strictly used only at his own leisure. Speaking of which, it's about time to get started. Mentally apologizing to his goddess, he snaked himself out of her embrace, gently as to not rise her from her peaceful slumber, before casting his gaze toward his equipment. Taking hold of his backpack, he threw it over his shoulders before putting on his leather boots, black gloves and lightweight armor. It was a very simple design of a stark white metallic sheen with crimson outlines. It was the current armor he bought under the blacksmith name of Welfkrazo, but he never managed to find the man to enlist him. The armor consisted of a light chest plate, shoulder guards, forearm protectors and shin guards. The armor served its purpose, it was cheap, and it protected him well enough. He didn't have the funds to buy other expensive armors, as most of his funds went to supporting him and Hestia. The excess amounts of volley he had were being transferred into the bank of Arario for a rainy day. Strapping his armor over his long-sleeved black shirt and black pants, then he went for his weapon of choice, and the very weapon Hestia had given to him as a gift 8 years ago, when he was just a few months into his adventuring career. Pulling out a small black sheath, he pulled out a jet black combat knife. It had a simple handle and grip with a small rectangular guard. The blade was as black as night, while the sharpened edge glinted in contrast. Beyond that it looked like a regular knife, but once he took hold of it, runic symbols lit up in a dim blue light along the length of the blade. Bell looked down at the weapon as Hestia's words ran through his mind when she first gave him the knife a few months after he joined her familia. This is a weapon that was forged by my friend, Hephaestus, the goddess of smithing. She is known as the divine smith of heaven, and all her works directly forged by her hand have been known to be legendary in of themselves. This particular weapon I helped forge with a little bit of my own essence. It is a sentient weapon, it is alive, and it will grow along with the strength of its wielder. It will take a while, but as you grow Belkun, so too will this weapon. Treat it as your partner just as you treat me, and I am sure it will help you in your adventure. The weapon had been a request Hestia made to Hephaestus, something made secret from him until gifted to him, and, rightfully, he was concerned about how much it took to make it. It took a while until Hestia admitted it would take a while for her to work off the amount she owed to her friend for making the weapon. At first, he wanted to give all the money he earned in return to pay off the debt, but Hestia readily refused, saying it was her gift to him for all he did for her. And so to not disrespect her wish, he reluctantly accepted but made sure to always check up on her when he wasn't in the dungeon. While he accepted her wish, it did not mean he wouldn't make sure she wasn't worked beyond her capability. However, he was always assured by the smithy goddess herself that Hestia was doing fine. He knew of Hephaestus through Hestia, and while she was serious and a hard-working goddess, the polar opposite of his own goddess, she was still a close friend to Hestia, and she always made sure she was well taken care of when he was gone in the labyrinth. Sighing, he sheathed the blade before strapping it on his lower back. Then he reached for the last two pieces of his equipment, which was probably the last two most important pieces that kept his identity a secret. The first was a full-body black cloak with a hood that covered his head. It was made to endure the extreme abnormal weather conditions of the lower floors of the labyrinth. It was made through the hide and scales of a mature dragon he'd found in the deeper levels of the dungeon, so its durability wasn't to be questioned. Once he put that on, he picked up the last piece of his equipment, which was in fact a mask, a plain white mask that he had picked up at a smithy shop in the Babel Tower above the labyrinth. According to the smithy, it was made through specific materials that was made for the specific resistance of the elements and through battle. It filtered oxygen through the air in case of poison being released into the atmosphere. But its simple use was to conceal the user's identity from others, unless the wearer removed the mask himself. Which was just perfect for him. The design itself was pretty plain. It was mostly white, with two red vertical lines going down the eye holes, and the grinning visage that made up the design. It oddly resembled a human skull's frontal visage, but it wasn't detrimental to him in any way. It served its purpose in more ways than one. Taking hold of it, he channeled his power into the mask before placing it over his face. For a moment, he took in the sensation of the mask latching onto his face, as if it had a mind of its own. But once it was on, he made sure the hood was covered his head, his crimson orbs adjusted to the slit eye holes of his mask. Taking extra measure to blink a few times, he turned his gaze onto the still slumbering goddess, and his gaze softened. Bending, he pat her head gently before covering her up. "Have a good sleep, Hestia-sama." Speaking his piece, the young adventurer turned away and crept off. Completely unaware of the fact that as he left, the woman's eyes creaked open before they looked over her shoulder. In contrast to the young man's crimson orbs, her orbs were like liquid sapphire that glinted with worry for the man that had left her. Off again, she let out a sigh. Worry was etched her pained expression as she curled up into the lasting body heat left behind from the man that was her sole familia dependent. And the cause for which had stolen the one thing that was highly coveted in heaven. The boy she saved 8 years ago had turned into such a man, had taken the one thing she valued just as much as she did her own innocence. Bel was the one who held her heart in his hands. "I swear to Hestia, on my body and soul, until the day I die, and even after the hands of the damnation takes me, I will forever be your sword that cuts down your enemies and your shield that will protect you from what you cannot defend against. You gave me a chance, and for that compassion, you may use me however you wish. Call upon me and I will be there, Kami-sama." The vow he made to her had been the same day he swore to her that wherever she went, wherever she wanted to go, he would follow her. She was his light and he was her hero. He would protect her where she could not and put down those that would seek to oppose and oppress her. He never ceased to amaze her at how he never stopped making her fall in love with him again and again. Pulling the cover closer, Hestia snuggled into the body heat, hoping on some small hope that it would last the night. It seemingly did, as a moment later she fell fast asleep again with the lasting body heat from the young man of her affections accompanied her throughout the entire night. Oh whoa, there was a certain method to dealing with the rising difficulty in the labyrinth beneath Arario. Due to the vast, almost immeasurable number of floors of the dungeon, it was considered to be the same choice that at the first few levels you could solo and pair up for the first few floors. However, beyond the 13th floor it was best to be in a party of other well-armed and experienced adventurers, supporters and blacksmiths to take on the harder and much more difficult floors. To traverse the deeper floors took days worth of time, and it wore on your health to venture on without a supporting hand or the well hand of a smithy to keep your equipment in check. It was plainly suicidal to go so deep without a party in hand. It was an ironclad rule of the guild that governed over the dungeon and the adventurers' affairs when concerning the massive labyrinth. It wasn't per se illegal, but it was ill-advised to go any deeper without a party in hand unless you were just actively seeking death at every turn. The reason, you may ask? Because the monsters inside not only grew more fierce and terrifying the deeper you went, but the more numerous they became. It isn't a lie to say a party would run into a horde of minotaurs numbering in the hundreds or a monster parade consisting of a massive variety of different types of monsters. Yet there were those rare few that were either foolishly brave or misconceived in their own strength to traverse the dungeon alone. And to date, on record, none had ever come back alive to survive traversing the labyrinth solo. It was simply madness to do so without the party the size of one like the Loki Familia, which garnered an entire army of adventurers, supporters and blacksmiths just to traverse the deeper levels. Truly, it was maddening to think of anyone remotely thinking of doing something so monumentally stupid and insane. Thankfully, Belle Tsutsuki fit that description perfectly. So, this is where you were hiding, Roku? The young man questioned as he walked upon a desolate labyrinth floor. It resembled a landscape similar to how one would picture hell. A land of brimstone, fire, lava, molten rock and surprise more fire. But the extreme heat didn't affect him, thanks to his cloak absorbing most of the heat. That wasn't to say he wasn't a bit annoyed with watching for breaks in the ground, since some were deceptively veiled lava pits. He should know, he'd nearly fallen in on more than one occasion. His words seemed to have effect as his crimson eyes looked upon one of the 5 volcanoes dotting the massive dungeon floor. And he cast his gaze upward to the top just in time as the ground beneath him began to quake. Tremors began to burst forth from the volcano before him before cracks formed along the land, causing showers of lava and molten rock to spew upwards into the air. But he paid it no mind as he watched the volcano erupt once before it began to break apart from something crawling out of the earthen cavity. Once a giant claw exploded out of the volcano, the young man simply unsheathed his knife before twisting it into a reverse grip. The claw came slamming down as the volcano rumbled erratically before another claw punched through the outer rim. Once the second claw took hold of the land, the creature inside pulled itself out of the molten core of the earth, allowing itself to bask in the freedom since its long rest. The creature was in fact a dragon, but not just any dragon, it was one he had been searching for, as it was one of the elder dragons rumored to dwell in the lowest levels of the labyrinth. It had the body of purely cooled molten rock with cracks of spewing lava forming the underbelly and throughout its neck and face. It was a gargantuan of a beast, one whose very height darkened the landscape and its wingspan spread out further, casting a veil over the land. But the object that had his interest was the giant horn on the dragon's forehead. It reared back its head, its molten orbs of liquid fire stared down at the intruder with a baleful glare that would have made any less of a man run in terror. And then it roared. Brog. For a moment, Belle was almost entirely certain the roar was powerful enough to have sent a small tremor toward even Arario, but from how deep he was sure it was a small one. Regardless, he moved just in time as the resulting roar sent a shockwave that caused the ground to rupture into multiple geysers of lava all around. Moving in a zigzag formation, he jumped from one rock to the next before landing on a boulder in the air before jumping off it. Propelling himself forward, he turned his gaze toward the dragon as it fully escaped the volcano, and only then did he pull out his knife. The wind seemed to beck at his command as it encompassed the length of his knife into a wind-sharpened edge that only grew a few more feet in length. And as he came down on the dragon, his eyes changed, a rippled-like pattern began to form just before he clashed with the dragon. And soon, the 69th floor of the Arario labyrinth erupted into hellfire as the two entities clashed. The Epic of Belle Tsutsuki. Chapter 1. Enter the not-so-rookie adventure. This has to be the most boring part of my job. That was the thought of one particular guard that kept watch of the gates leading down into the labyrinth beneath Arario. He, like many that worked for the guild which governed over the labyrinth's affairs, was one of the few that instead of taking up a job for being a receptionist or working as an appraiser of magic stones or drop items from the monsters below, instead chose another position. That being the guild's enforcers, which was in reality glorified guards that kept watch on those going in and out of the labyrinth, and the position sucked royally. No matter how much his colleagues tried to say it was a fine position, it just wasn't. There was no excitement to be had in being a glorified watchman. The only thing guards really did was stand around day and night watching adventurers go in and out. It was more like you were a statue than anything else. Hell, the majority of adventurers didn't even go into the dungeon so late at night and usually just went in at the start of morning or during midday. The official duty of a guard had a varied amount of duties. The first was to regulate adventurers wanting to go into the labyrinth, making sure they had certified documentation to go inside before letting them on by. The second was to be a lookout on any adventurers that were too obviously ill-equipped to go into the dungeon and to save them from an early grave, persuade them to go back. Or if there were any adventurers to come out on death's door and get them medical attention as quickly as they could. The third and most important duty was to keep an eye on the entrance to the labyrinth and be aware of any monster sightings, which if there were they were to send an alarm straight back to the guild HQ to warn them. But it just didn't happen since the Babel Tower that was built on top of the labyrinth served as a means to keep watch on the monsters that could potentially escape and warn the combat familias in Arario. To date there have only been a few monsters that have escaped, but they were either quickly destroyed before they spread into the city of Arario. Or those that did escape have stretched to the far corners of the world by now, and they were some of the most legendary ones in ancient history. Still, this did little to detract this particular guard's annoyance. It was reaching early morning, and there had been no sign of an adventurer coming in and none coming out. Which left him to stand guard and just stand there, doing nothing for the entire night. I swear nothing ever exciting ever happens in this position, but I suppose it's better than dealing with those Soma Familia nut jobs at HQ. With that thought firmly in his mind, the guard stood there for a few more minutes just burning time away by looking up at the sky. That is until the ground started to shake. What the fuck? Alarmed, the guard stopped and stumbled as the ground beneath his feet quaked for a moment before stopping, then it happened again. It was small quakes happening in second intervals, but it was enough to alarm the guard as he cast his gaze to where he heard the sound of the quakes coming from. It was as if Goliath was walking toward him, but when he looked toward the entrance into the labyrinth, he was stricken in place by what he saw coming out of the darkness. It was a man, possibly a younger man by his physical stature, to which he figured was around 5'10", though that was a rough estimate. His entire body was covered by a long tattered black cloak with a hood that covered his head, though strangely there were two pointed ends coming up from underneath the hood. Anything that was possibly underneath that cloak was well hidden to his eyes, as the cloak just covered the entire upper and mid part of his body, while it reached down to his ankles. The cloak itself seemed to have seen much better days as it was tattered and torn in specific places. It almost seemed like it had been through an inferno of sorts. But when the young man came out of the entrance, the guard finally saw his face. By the gods, it's him. His body broke out in a cold sweat as his eyes looked upon the masked visage of what was possibly his worst nightmare come to life. It was a plain white mask resembling a human skull with a grinning expression. The only detail on the mask was two red marks went down the sides of the mask. But then the guard's eyes met the eyes behind the slit eye holes of the mask, and what greeted him was possibly the most terrifying pair of eyes he had ever seen. It lasted only a second, but what he saw was two orbs that seemed to be like smoldering embers, darker than blood, but more unholy than even the eyes of a dragon. They were the eyes of something else, something beyond his understanding. They were the eyes of a demon, the eyes of a Diablo, he muttered under his breath. The terror in his voice was thick as he watched the man walk past him without a second thought, and for a moment his eyes caught sight of what the man was carrying on his back. And if possible his nervousness evolved into a complete meltdown. The poor guard went into a nervous breakdown as he saw the reason as to why the ground was shaking under his feet. Because the cloaked adventurer was carrying a giant dragon's horn 10 times his size. It was a monstrous thing, possibly as tall as one of the buildings in Arario. It curled upward slightly, but the entire thing was jet black, a rare type of dragon's horn that only those of elder dragons or above had. And the adventurer was carrying the monstrosity around as if it weighed absolutely nothing. The poor guard wouldn't realize it until later that he had blacked out on the spot. "Oh whoa, you never cease to amaze to me, you know that," spoke a rather seemingly normal old man garbed in fancy yellow and purple attire, with a violet cape wrapped around his shoulders, which was clipped together by a gold insignia that matched the guild's crest. He had long white hair and a wrinkled face that held a slightly appreciative expression. But contrary to his old appearance, his wise and sharp black orbs looked directly across into a pair of crimson orbs that radiated the same amount of power as the old man had in wisdom. "I never fail a request no matter how difficult it may seem. I thought after all this time you would know this by now, Oranos-san." What came out was a garbled voice of what would be a young man. But the mask muffled his voice into one that was deep and unrecognizable to most, but to the old man he knew all too well who the man behind the mask was. Oranos, god of the sky and head of the guild situated in Arario, simply allowed a small quirk from the corner of his lips, which was his way of smirking, before it turned back into his ever-present stoic expression. True enough. Then his eyes trailed from the young man and to the dragon's horn between them, which was in front of the guild HQ. Letting out a small sigh, he took his hand and ran it over the length of giant bone object. Impressive, from what I can feel from this the dragon you fought, the one called Roku was an older one of its species. An elder from the colorization of the horn, no doubt about that, and from the small amount of heat still coming off it, I wager it was an ember dragon, been a long time since I've last seen one of those. The old god rambled on as he appraised the horn before giving a nod to himself, while the masked adventurer stood by and watched silently. Standing up he straightened himself out before turning his gaze on the cloaked young man. Very good, I'll have this further appraised and have Hephaestus come pick it up. I wager she'll be ecstatic to have this for her work. Now, as for the matter of your payment, he questioned, though the man spoke up in regards to that. Just the usual, old man, funnel the funds to my account. He said, causing the god to close his eyes before he shook his head in what seemed like exasperation. But he was used to this, the young man was always a stickler when it came to his money, so he had the vast majority he saved up locked away in the Arario bank, in the deepest part of its vaults. I see, well, go on ahead and get some rest, and once again a job well done, Diablo. He said with a small trickle of amusement. It was almost non-existent, but it was there, the amusement he had played across his eyes as he watched the young man flinch at the name. But the adventurer remained silent as he turned around and walked away while Oranos watched him go, and as he vanished from his eyes, a figure melded out from the darkness by the wall behind Oranos. The god didn't flinch though as he addressed a black specter behind him with all the impassive expression he was known for. Anything to report? The entity of ebony shifted in its posture before replying to him. She has made a few attempts to break the barrier around the young man, but so far my magic holds. She has learned nothing substantial so far, but it's only a matter of time until she breaks it. When it does, it will be out of my hands. The creature responded, causing the god to close his eyes before giving a small nod. Acknowledging the answer he was given as satisfactory before he gave a small hum of disinterest. Well, do not worry then. It's held for all these years, and it was bound time for it to break, so when it does the boy can deal with her shenanigans. My debt to Hestia was paid when I had you put in on the boy, and when it runs out, it'll be up to him to deal with it. He said, to which the shadowy humanoid tilted its head slightly, as if questioning its master's words. Not that I'm questioning his ability, but that woman is as sly as a fox and as dangerous as a snake. Do you believe he can take care of her if the time comes? The entity questioned, causing Oranos to raise an eyebrow before looking at the figure with an almost curious glint on his old eyes. The boy's had to live with that firecracker Hestia for 8 years now. If he can keep her docile, then that woman will be simple for him, but I'm more curious as to your interest in the subject. I didn't take you to be worried about the boy, Fells. The unasked question spoken from his lips was left unattended for a moment as the spectre remained silent. That is, until it finally found the right words to reply in kind to its master. It's not that I'm worried about him, he has proven his skill enough for me to actually wager he knows more about the labyrinth than anyone on the lower world. I just find him interesting, Orano-sama. I'm sure you've felt it as well from dealing with him for so long. The kind of presence he gives off is too unnatural to be human or even a part of the other races, and his power has reached the point that it is well beyond our scope now. So, my lord, it's not that I'm worried about him, but more to the fact I am interested in exactly what he is. The figure stated, causing the god frown before giving a small nod. I see, I understand now. But he has his secrets, as do we all, and I will not behave like the rest of my kind that's gone stir crazy over his existence. He's done nothing to scorn me and has proven worthy of one to have my utmost respect. Besides, it will prove unwise to cross him at this point now. He said as his eyes trailed toward the dragon horn beside him, as if that explained his reasoning, and the figure upon seeing it only shifted its head in acknowledgement. That is most wise, Orano-sama. Oh whoa, there was only 3 words that could describe what he was feeling like at the moment. He was exhausted. Then again, that's the risks of fighting an elder dragon alone and taking back its horn all the way back up from the 69th floor. He sighed for a moment as the exhaustion began to wear down on him. The cloaked adventurer made his way back to the abandoned church in the outer districts of Arario and fumbled his way inside after making sure no one had followed him. His body was slumped as he made his way forward before taking a ride and opening the door to the right of the podium stand. It showed a staircase that led downwards. Going down it, he could feel the homey atmosphere of his and Hestia's home begin to encompass his worn-out body. Finally he made it to another door and opened it, revealing his and Hestia's small-like abode. It was Spartan for the most part, consisting of a tall dresser to his left, a small chest situated to the right of the wall near the door, his worn-out couch and a coffee table. And the queen-size bed at the left which was adjacent to the window to the right of the room. There was 4 candle stands that were left lit, which made him see a sight that made him lighten up as he walked in. Beautiful. That's all he could think to describe the beautiful female before his eyes. He looked upon his goddess that lay asleep peacefully in bed. Hestia had the appearance of a teenager with such a small body, but the contradictory to that was robust bosom and wide hips which said otherwise. However, he saw a beauty that lay beyond the flesh of the body. What he saw every time he looked at the black-haired blue-eyed goddess was a beautiful innocent soul that he swore to protect till his dying breath. He remembered that it was a promise he made to her after half a year of being with Hestia. At that time, he had been a lost little boy with no other direction than to keep throwing himself into the labyrinth in hopes he would get stronger. It was foolish and suicidal, but it was all he had at the time. Yet Hestia had come into his life shortly after and offered him a hand of support, a hand filled with all the compassion he hadn't expected from a complete stranger. Yet it had been enough to push away his sorrow and the darkness that feasted upon his mental state at the time. And for that, he couldn't repay, which is why he swore to always be at her side whenever she needed it. However, he never expected himself to fall for her in the process. But I suppose I had fallen for her the moment I met her. She is the light within my soul. He thought as he looked upon Hestia from the foot of the bed. His feelings for her were simple in theory, but the concept of a potential relationship between himself and Hestia, a goddess, had always weighed hard on his mind. It wasn't the fact that he was afraid if she denied him, he had long since accepted that potential outcome. And he certainly wasn't worried about the repercussions if it reached the other gods' ears. No, he'd stand at her side and have his knife at their throats the moment they so much as threatened her safety. No, he was worried about his own feelings for not just her, but for others that had come into his life, for the few that had become more sparks of light that kept his soul alive. For the few friends he had made in Arario which he could count on just his 2 hands, a few he had come to gain similar feelings he had for Hestia, maybe not as strong, but they were there regardless. I guess that makes me more of a scumbag than anything else if I'm having feelings for more than one woman. Giving a sigh, he kicked off his boots before he started removing his cloak and mask. His hair left unrestrained by his hood came down past his shoulders. It was the brightest white one would ever see, unlike the silver hair one would have as they grew older. His was just pure white. In his youth it had a certain wave to it and it had reached his to neckline, but as he grew and with his career as an adventurer taking up the majority of his time, he had just let it grow out. It now had a slight spike to it as fell around his shoulders in a spiky mess, while at the top most of his hair remained straight. A few bangs fell around his red eyes while the rest covered his ears. His face had lost most of the baby fat that once plagued him as a child, and replacing it was a firm visage. A strong jawline matched with his sharp crimson red eyes. It was, in the words of his goddess, the face of a heartbreaker, not that he really understood what she meant by that. However, the most unusual aspect of the young man was possible the most strange and his deepest secret. He only needed to look in the mirror to see, coming out his skull and popping out from his hair, was a dual pair of sharp crimson horns. Just seeing them made him frown as he reached up and felt the tip only to wince when he felt the tip pierce his flesh at the tiniest amount of pressure. They seemed to have grown last I checked. He wasn't exactly proud of this change in his physical appearance, as it only solidified his own opinion that he wasn't human. Hell, he wasn't even a part of the other races among the lower world, because as far as he knew there was not race that grew out horns like this. It only made him feel more troubled as to what he was exactly, an unease that's been building up ever since his grandfather helped unlock his natural-born power so long ago. Thankfully, he had a method to fixing this. Moving his hands together, Bell let out a sigh before he bit his thumb before touching each of his fingers on his right hand, before placing his palm over his chest, particularly over his heart. Then he let out a small word for the spell he had created to deal with this physical change in himself. Sealing sequence begin. First gate locked, second gate locked, third gate locked, fourth gate locked, fifth gate locked, sixth gate locked, seventh gate locked, eighth gate locked, ninth gate locked, 10th gate locked. Beginning seal matrix over the soul complete. Perfect sealing synchronization a success. Sealing process begin. And before his eyes a dim blue light encompassed his body. It burned bright before it flickered and dimmed moments later, revealing a severely changed Bell. He had shrunk from his 5'10" height, now he stood at a 5'5". His shoulder-length white hair was now at his neckline and had the wave to it from his youth along his face, having some baby fat, but not as much as he once did. But the most important change in his opinion was the horns were gone. Seeing that made him let out a sigh of relief. That was a technique he created in secret, even from Hestia. It manipulated the fauna bestowed upon him by his goddess. It acted as a chain seal which locked away the majority of his power, and in the process the physical changes he underwent as he grew stronger. Now he simply had the appearance of Bell Tsutsuki, the rookie adventurer most of Arario and his friends besides Hestia knew him as. Having the appearance of an unassuming young boy with little experience as an adventurer proved to be a great asset as it made the majority underestimate him. Well, besides those few that could read underneath his actions or those even more rare few that knew his secret identity. Now time for bed. Stumbling around, he ignored his couch as he simply didn't want to waste the extra effort to make those 3 small steps and simply fell into Hestia's bed and crawled into the other side of the headboard. Turning his body so he could see his goddess, he wrapped his arms around her small body and pulled her close. Without thinking at this point, he laid his head atop hers, and then, only then did he allow himself the luxury to close his eyes, as he knew what awaited him was the ever-present nightmare every time he fell asleep. Thankfully, Hestia's warmth staved off the ever-growing darkness, if only for a little bit. "Oh whoa, Belkuun," the voice of an angel reverberated through his ears, calming him even more as he snuggled more into the mattress. His face melded into the pillow as his arm circled closer around the other warm pillow that was squirming around in his arms ever so slightly. Strange. I am MMBL kun wakey wakey. Strangely, the voice reminded him of his goddess, which began to prod him, and yet he couldn't find the strength to move from his personal heaven. Strangely, his warm pillow was squirming a bit more, and to stop it from escaping, he took of it with his left hand, grabbing a firm hold of its fluffy soft squishy substance. Wait a moment. Be Bell kun. From the sound of moaning, Bell felt a cold sense of dread go down his spine, and he prayed to all the gods and goddesses that he wasn't doing what he thought he was doing. Finally he worked the courage to creak his eyes open only to see the face of Hestia with her eyes closed, while her face was twisted in an odd expression of pleasure. Her breathing was labored, and her whole face was flushed a dark crimson which only intensified Bell's own dread. Finally he felt for his hands only to see Hestia twitch as his left hand grasped hold of her left butt cheek, felt only through the fabric of her panties. Then he felt for his right hand only for him to feel his fingers sink into her right breast. Oh no. He made the mistake to try and retract his hands, while his eyes traveled back to Hestia, only to see her blue eyes staring into his red ones with an odd sense of disappointment, but more than that she was a bit flustered from his touchy-feely episode. He froze as she finally worked her hands to grasp his face, making him stare hard into her flustered red face and pouting blue eyes. "You're gonna take responsibility for that, Bell kun. You touched me in so many ways that I was almost afraid you would ravage me in your sleep. Oh yes, you're gonna take responsibility for this, Belkuun," she said in a sing-song of a voice which carried a hint of mischief. Then she closed in onto his face and gave a small kiss to his forehead, which lasted for a second longer than usual, before she pulled away allowing her to see a sight that made her calm exterior break into a fit of hysteria. Bell's face resembled a tomato at this point from how crimson it was, his slack jaw was moving up and down desperately trying to make words. But nothing came up but the sheer embarrassment of what he did to his goddess. It was an awkward hour later for Bell before he and Hestia had made their way outside their humble little abode before they made their way into Arario. The goddess kept on happily whistling a jolly tune while Bell walked beside her with his face still buried in his hands. The embarrassment from before still very fresh in the young man's mind. It wasn't like he didn't enjoy it because he did, some small part of his mind relished the feeling, but the majority of his mind was just burning in embarrassment from Hestia's words of what he did. He hadn't been completely conscious of his actions at the time, so he really wasn't sure of what he had done at the time, which made the entire situation all the more troublesome for him. "Alright, this is where we split, Bell kun." Hestia's voice broke him from his state for a moment, to which he looked at her, and for a moment he took in her appearance. She had a part-time job with her friend Hephaestus that she's been a part of ever since she helped the goddess of smithing forge his weapon 8 years ago. She was wearing brown dress shoes and white stockings that reached her thighs. A red and white uniform that Hephaestus made her wear to draw in more customers, and seeing as it reached a few inches below her waist, he could see why. Her hair was as always tied up in 2 long twin tails, which were held together by her usual white and blue hair ornaments, which had 2 bell-like ornaments tied together with it also. Overall, despite her small stature, Hestia was still a beautiful young woman, one of the most beautiful he has ever seen. But that didn't mean he would allow other men to look at her that way, let alone touch her, unless they wanted to lose their eyes and arms and legs in there, just for good measure. Sighing, Bell finally pushed away his embarrassment from before and offered a smile to Hestia. "Alright, and remember, don't work too hard, okay?" he said, causing her to smile just a bit more before she took hold of his shoulders, causing him to blink before she stood on her tiptoes. Then she leaned in and kissed him on the cheek before back away with a small flush on her cheeks. "You worry too much, Bell kun, now I'll see you later tonight." With a wave she ran off, leaving Bell in the middle of the street with many civilians of Arario who had seen the interaction either smirking or just gushing at what they saw to be so cute, the females obviously. Touching the spot where Hestia had kissed him, he still felt the phantom sensation which caused a small smile of his own to form. Then Bell took in a breath of fresh air before he turned around and with an extra step made way towards the guild for his annual quest for the day. This was how he supported himself and Hestia, which was through his double adventurous activities. In the day he worked as the rookie adventurer Bell that the majority of the guild to come to know him as. He would go in the first few levels of the dungeon just to rake in magic stones and take on a quest for a specific item needed in those floors. While in the night, he took on his other persona and further explored the deeper floors of the labyrinth on his own. Utilizing his skills to make himself stronger and cultivating the varies of magic cores he gets from the monsters he kills. Very rarely he took on quests when he went exploring the dungeon's deeper levels. The one he took the night before had been truly out of the kindness of his heart as he had a somewhat good friendship with Hephaestus, even though she didn't know who he really was under the mask. She was a close friend of his goddess and one that he could trust to take care of her when he wasn't around. Well, that and he knew she made equipment that was bar none and he was interested to see what she could make with a material she hadn't handled before. Finally, Bell came inside of the guild and he stopped to look himself over. As this persona in the day he took the appearance of any rookie adventurer that could barely afford the most modest of equipment, which was why he wore simple attire consisting of a black t-shirt that was tucked in, black pants with a brown leather belt around his waist, while the pant legs were tucked into his shin-high light brown boots. Over this he wore a simple sandy brown leather jacket with a black diagonal stripe going down his right shoulder. The only unusual thing about him was the black knife sheathed on his left hip. He didn't care if anyone questioned why he had such a fancy-looking knife for a rookie adventurer. This had been a gift given to him by Hestia 8 years ago, and it had been his weapon of choice since that day. He'd sooner take his own life than to simply use another weapon just for convenience's sake. Alright, everything seems to be in order, time to go see Eina-san and see if there is quests on the board. With his mind set, Bell went on ahead. However, as he got closer he began to take notice of a large crowd building up around the guild entrance. Being just a tad bit curious he got closer and began to slip in unnoticed. All the while he heard the crowd of adventurers and civilians of Arario whispering in awe amongst themselves. "I can't believe it, is that what I think it is? He did it again, that maniac actually did it again. I think he actually came here with that thing over his shoulder. How the bloody hell strong is the guy?" Hearing the whispers made Bell became almost aware of the situation, but to fully sate it, he got through the crowd to see what was so amazing, and what he saw only made him internally slump his shoulders. Because before them was the very exact same horn he had ripped off the corpse of Roku last night and carried back up from the labyrinth and into Arario. And from some of the comments the guard at the entrance must have seen him and spread the rumor into the city. Great, just what he needed, more publicity. Although, Bell did smile amusingly when he saw Hephaestus, the goddess of the smith herself, hugging the giant horn with an almost love-struck expression on her face. That woman sure loved her rare materials. Finally he tore his gaze from the sight and began making his way to the quest board, and once he found something pretty simple, he took it off and made his way to the reception desk. There he found one of his few rare friends in Arario and his personal advisor. "Eina-chan," he called out as he came up to her desk, and he watched as the half-elf half-human young woman jolted from her work and spun around to look at him. Her appearance was very beautiful in his own humble opinion. She had straight shoulder-length brown hair and emerald orbs that in the sunlight glinted like true emeralds. She had a slim but mature physique of a growing woman with wide hips, long legs and a moderate-sized bosom. She had a naturally born fair complexion that was just a tad darker than Hestia's own. She was dressed in the standard black and white guild uniform for all employees that worked inside the HQ, but it did nothing to detract her natural beauty to him. However, her expression was clearly worked as her glasses were slid down to the bridge of her nose and her hair was a tad bit frazzled, but overall, Bell was left a bit speechless as he looked at her again. Eina Tull, aged 19, was someone he'd known since he was 9 years old. She was still learning to be an employee at the guild at the time when he was adventuring. She became his first friend outside of Hestia, and after a while he hit it off with her despite her being 4 years his senior in terms of age. Of course she knew nothing of his other persona and he preferred it to be kept that way for as long as possible, but outside of that she was made to be his personal advisor due to their close relationship with one another. "Ah, Bell-kun. Here for another quest again, I see," she questioned, eyeing the request paper in his hand, to which he gave a small grin before handing it for her stamp of approval. "Yup. The reward's nice and it'll help pay for some expenses that have been getting stressful as of late," he said, which she nodded knowingly. She understood his plight as he was the only member of the Hestia familia it fell on him to support himself and Hestia. Well, it was only the two of them, it was difficult for such a young adventurer like Bell to handle. Still, he'd proven to hours he could handle the responsibility for the past few years, which only made her respect for him grow. And a well-hidden admiration for all his efforts, but that was besides the point. So it's for the Ganesha familia. Collect 100 pounds of kobold meat. I see it must be in preparation for the monsterphilia this year," she said while giving it a stamp. Kobolds were low-level species of monsters that resided in the first few floors of the dungeon. All weak they could be dangerous to new adventurers when in a pack, but Bell had proven to her long ago that he could handle himself very well in the first few upper floors. At the mention of the monsterphilia, Bell quirked an eyebrow. He knew of the festival, but didn't see the interest in it. You only watch the tamers of the Ganesha familia play a show for the crowd and tame wild monsters in the stadium, when in fact they were already beaten and trained in the dungeon beforehand. It was all a show, an act, and he found no interest in such an act. He killed monsters for a living. The only kind of monster he wanted to see was a dead one. "Well, here you go, and be safe out there, Belkun, alright," she said, giving him a hard stare as she handing him back his request paper. Now either under this persona or the other, he simply could not handle that expression she gave him. It was that kind of look that just knew you'd get in trouble regardless of being careful. It was a look that just showed how much she really knew him, and she knew he could be quite reckless at times. "Yeah, I got it by the way before I leave, what's with all the ruckus? And why do you seem so overworked, Eina-chan?" he questioned. Well, he didn't care all that much for the ruckus behind him, he was worried about the health for the young woman. She was one his precious few friends he had in Arario, and he'd be damned to see her be worked to the bare bone like this. Eina for her part gave him a weird look before letting out a sigh. Leaning forward she put her face in her hands and just tore her gaze to the center of the room where Hephaestus was having members of her familia begin taking the giant dragon horn off. Well, it would seem the infamous Diablo took in a special request for Hephaestus Amma made the night before and went off to complete it. It was said he returned early this morning with that monstrosity, she said, pointing at the giant dragon horn the familia was struggling to get through the door, let alone pick up. From what I know of the request, it was made specifically for him as it was made to kill an elder dragon, the third of the 5 strongest class types of the dragons, if you didn't know, Belkun. It was to attain an elder's dragon horn, which is said to immensely outweigh its value in volley, as its value for materials used in crafting is akin to being legendary in of itself. Though this is the first time I've seen one, I'm surprised it's not damaged the room from how much the thing must weigh, she said, causing Bell to chuckle slightly, but due to his lack of interest, he never saw Eina catch his slightly bored expression, but said nothing of it. Diablo-san just keeps doing the impossible, doesn't he? He said, causing Eina to let out a laugh at that. That's putting it very very mildly, Belkun, she said so sweetly, to which Bell shook his head at, but still he took a moment to think on the name given to him, the alias he was branded with and was known by throughout Arario. Diablo had been the name he was branded with by the gods and goddesses long ago when he first created his split persona when he turned 9. By that time he was growing far too powerful, far too quickly for his own good. Aurelius Frey's ability ultimately sped up his growth to dangerous degrees, enough so that he was worried he would attract the wrong attention, not for himself, but for those he cared for. Namely Hestia and Eina at the time, but that list grew to a few others, and because of that he underwent a persona change to protect them. Since then, he was branded under that alias because of his sudden rise to power and the amount of deeds he had accomplished during the start of his career. He was a sole existence that invaded the labyrinth on his own and came out successful in exploring the most dangerous levels that to this day were now being officially explored by the Loki familia. He was the one who provided roughly drawn maps of the deeper floors, the very same maps that the Loki familia used in their monthly expeditions. It was ironic really, he hadn't been branded that name until he had killed what was possibly one of his most dangerous battles to date. He had nearly died that day and had the scars to prove it. He had been 9 years old and he had battled with the floor boss of the 59th floor. It was an ancient being, a dragon, king class, but one that had fallen from the grace of its dragon, kind for eating the corpses of its brethren to gather power, so it could reach the domain of the gods. The god of the dragons, Bahamut, from the story had battled with the dragon and stripped it of its scales and ripped its lower body in half and sealed the upper half into the labyrinth, since the dragon refused to die even under such injuries. For a moment Bell reached toward his abdomen where he felt a phantom pain thrum through his body, while his eyes narrowed at where he thought went to. Seeth the scowl as he remembered that monstrosity. It nearly tore him in half and sent him tumbling to death's door more than a few times during the battle. Still he miraculously survived the encounter and ripped out the dragon's cold corrupted heart from its corpse and brought it back as a trophy. That had been the day. From what he heard from Hestia, the gods and goddesses held an immediate meeting to discuss what he had done. Cause he had essentially done what no other adventurer had ever done before. He had essentially killed what a god could not, and that was not something you couldn't ignore. That was the day he was given the one alias he didn't expect to be put under. He aspired to be a hero to those he called his friends, but that day he was ironically named Diablo, the Castilian word for the god's greatest enemy. The devil. Oh, the irony still hurt to this very day. Because of that, Bel held suspicions for the other deities. They had to be suspicious of him to name him the one thing that the gods themselves abhorred as the greatest enemy against a deity. However, what came next was the infamy that was his reputation as Diablo. He essentially became a living legend talked about amongst other adventurers. A made-up story for parents to tell their children about at night, of his overly dramatized battle with Seath for one. He essentially became something akin to what most adventurers aimed to become. A legend, one whose name was etched into the history books and would be remembered for centuries to come. Thing was, he didn't care about that. He was interested in one thing, and that was to become a hero to those that accepted him, to his friends that cared for him, that loved him for who he was. His original dream to be a hero to the world was long since abolished by his own foolishness, and in its place, he dreamed to become a hero to those of his friends. If he could keep them safe, then that was all that really mattered to him because they in turn were the ones who saved him from himself. Shaking his head from his thoughts, he looked at Eina who was eyeing him weirdly for a moment and he soon let out a chuckle. "Sorry, I got caught up in my thoughts. Anyway, why do you look so overworked?" he asked, to which the half-breed let out another sigh. "It's just the Soma Familia, they've been getting rowdy as of late more than usual and they've been pressuring the guild for some time now. They've been hounding our appraisers and calling the guild all sorts of insults, and while that's not all that concerning, there have been reports of them harassing our employees. I swear sometimes I just want to smash them upside the head," she said, slamming her hand into the desk, which to his slight surprise made it crack all the way down the middle. Take notice the desk was made of pure refined granite. Gulping, Bel took notice Eina's expression and his face softened, but inwardly he scowled as he thought about ways to help her with the situation. "I can't outright kill any Soma Familia members, that's just needless and mostly unwanted attention, but I can't let them keep harassing Eina. Maybe I should speak to Hestia about them, but for now." Thinking to himself, Bel nodded before he took hold of Eina's hands in his own. The action caused to blink in surprise before she looked up to see his beautiful crimson eyes staring back at her with enthusiasm. "Eina, go out with me," he said, blunt and to the point, causing her blink, then twice, 3 times and a fourth for good measure. Then her face erupted into such a beautiful shade of crimson that nearby workers were afraid her head would combust from the sheer heat coming off her face. Her mouth turned into a shake smile as she repeated Bel's words again and again inside her head, trying in some way to find out why of all things Bel would say that to her. Not that she was against going on a date with him or anything. It was just, but Bel kun, what about our age gap, and would you really want to go out with someone like me? I mean you have Hestia Sama and. The poor woman stammered as Bel just tilted his head to the side, not exactly realizing what she implying, but spoke anyway. "I don't see how our age has anything to do with this. I've known you for quite some time, and I know you're an incredible woman and a good person at heart. Hestia may seem ill-tempered, but she recognizes you as one of my friends, so she doesn't mind," he explained, but to the poor woman's mind it only increased her misunderstanding of the entire situation at hand. Her blush darkened to such a degree that Bel was beginning to worry for her health. But why you she lost it. She fainted dead into Bel's arms, causing the poor young man to straight out panic. Eina-chan. Are you alright? Crap, are you okay? He asked, but she remained unresponsive, but thankfully another one of the staff came up to him. "Give her to me, Bel-san, I'll be sure she gets taken care of." Hearing this, Bel looked to see it was another young woman that was around Eina's age. She had pink hair and pink eyes and wore the same uniform as Eina. Then his eyes lit up with recognition as he realized who the woman was, and he sighed in relief as he put Eina in the woman's arms. "Thanks a bunch, Misha, and would you mind telling her that I just wanted to see if she would meet me at the Hostess of Fertility tonight? She needs some rest and I'd like to buy her dinner, you see," he said, causing Misha's eyes to widen briefly before she let out a small chuckle, amusement dancing across her eyes as she peered down at the face of her friend. Realizing that Eina had completely misunderstood what Bells was going to say. Oh, she was going to tease the hell out of her after this. Smiling at the white-haired young man that was Eina's very close friend, that was a boy, who was most certainly not in Eina's exact words her boyfriend, he was just her friend that was a boy. The thought alone made Misha internally giggle before she gave him an affirmative nod. "No worries, you can count on me," she said with a grin, causing Bell to sigh in relief, and with another thank you he hightailed it out of there. Time to get the daily request done. Something simple, surely nothing surprising would arise from this, right? Don't count on it. Chapter 2. Eclipsing Shadow. Sometimes, it was never a really good idea to tempt fate, because in all likelihood fate, being the mean bitch that she was, would strike back with all the fury of 1,000 suns. And sometimes it would be at the most random of times in the day. And for one white-haired, crimson-eyed, 15-year-old adventurer, this could not have been more true, as his current situation was the exemplar of that type of scenario. Karma's a bitch. His thoughts ran along the lines of his frustration. Bell Tsutsuki knew for a simple fact that the current predicament that he was in had been all because of his own acts of tempting, slapping and figuratively doing all he could to piss fate off. All his 8 years of exploring and training alone in the Labyrinth in Arario, the most dangerous place in the known world mind you, had finally caught up to him in this one simple act of what was supposed to be an easy request. Collect 100 pounds of kobold meat. He got it completed and had the sack of meat conveniently held in one of his more unique abilities. Because he surely couldn't be running around with a giant sack of meat while running away from a rampaging, bloodthirsty horde of minotaurs, now could he? Not so much. Rog. The roar of maybe 10 or 20 minotaurs, a rough estimate really, was barreling after him. No doubt all of them wielding some form of weapon formed from the very environment of the labyrinth itself. Seeing as the very thing, from his personal experience, was alive in of itself, truly he expected nothing less from the mother of all the monsters would equip its children with whatever weapons they needed. A name bestowed upon the labyrinth by the gods themselves, seeing as the thing was just a giant womb to bring the creatures to life in the first place. He should know, exploring the labyrinth for 8 years by himself had allowed him to see the secrets of the labyrinth that most adventurers would never realize in their lifetime. He had seen the birth of many monsters, some small and some monumentally gigantic. The labyrinth was a mother and, in theory, wanted to protect its children, which was why it armed its spawns with whatever they needed to kill those that intruded inside. And the children themselves were instinctively aware of their goal, some more so than others. However, that wasn't the same for those that had grown far more powerful than they were originally intended. If they became more sentient, then they were bound to be far more dangerous than most of their brethren. But most monsters knew where they should reside. The strong dwelled only in the lower levels, of the weaker ones would reside at the top floors. That's how it should be. How it was meant to be. But no, they had to go and fuck it up, didn't they? Bell's thoughts were the mirrored expression of his annoyance as he ran from the minotaurs chasing him down all around the 6th floor of the labyrinth. Now one may wonder as to who Bell was referring to, and it could only be explained in 3 words. 3 words that only brought him annoyance as he kept the minotaurs on his tail and away from the other rookie adventurers fleeing from this floor so they wouldn't be crushed by the rampaging group of monsters. The Loki Familia. He knew them, they were one of the higher echelon of exploration and combat familias residing in Arario. They were highly praised for their deeds in the labyrinth and the one familia to have completed the most requests for the guild. They brought back enough magic stones and rare items dropped from the monsters to bring in more merchants for Arario and in turn make it flourish even more economically. However, unofficially their captain, Fin, was the one to have purchased his maps of the deeper levels so it would lower the risk of their future expeditions. He was a good man, a part of the declining Palom race, but still a good sort. Bell would admit he'd seen him only a few times, but never actually spoke with him as either persona. However, from just seeing him from the crowd he could tell the captain of the Loki Familia was a very level-headed and mature person and one he could respect as an adventurer. The same, however, could not be said for his subordinates, the very same who caused this mess in the first place. Now one may wonder as to how Bell knew this particular detail, and that was because he knew the Familia had made an expedition at the beginning of this month and were due to return any day by then. It was always a big topic that was spoken about amongst the lower level adventurers and it served as a means for him to be on the lookout when delving into the labyrinth as his other persona. And while he didn't know Finn's subordinates personally, he knew of them and their reckless behavior at times. How he knew that was very simple. 5 years ago when he was 10 years old he had been returning from the 66th floor only to stop when he reached the 35th floor. He had come across the Loki Familia, recognizing their banners, only to see them being surrounded by a monster parade that the labyrinth spawned onto them. It had been the first time he came across them, but to protect his identity and help them in some way he utilized one of his abnormal techniques that couldn't be recorded by Hestia's grace. It was powerful enough to shift the tide and help them crush the remaining monsters. And under the cover of the smoke and confusion he remembered fleeing, but that's where his memory got fuzzy, as if something was there, but he just couldn't remember. One would think they would have learned to be more cautious since 5 years ago, but their latest recruits don't seem to have learned that lesson as of yet. Bell thought to himself as turned a corner only to grimace as he saw another adventurer strewn on the ground ahead of him, dead and at the feet of a stray minotaur. Scowling deeply, he channeled his chakra throughout his legs and arms, temporarily boosting his power. Moving faster he brandished his knife, then jumping to the wall of his left, then right and then left he jumped toward the monster. Coming upon its head he came down in the blink of an eye, his knife piercing the minotaur's skull like it was wet paper. As the body dispersed into black dust, Bell stopped even as the minotaurs behind him came closer. He just knelt down at the corpse of another adventurer that was killed by the minotaurs rampaging throughout the 6th floor. His red eyes gleamed in the darkness as his annoyance turned into anger as he looked upon another casualty of reckless behavior. It was one of the few he had come across too late and were caught unawares by the monsters coming up from the lower levels. They were the unlucky few he couldn't save, and for each one only increased his anger for the monsters that killed them and the familia that caused this. They're gonna pay for this. Taking his hand, he moved it down the terrified face of the latest dead adventurer. It was a young girl, a little one, possibly 13 or 12 by her appearance, and her face was struck in a state of pure terror as her body was bisected by the Minotaur from before. Closing her eyes forever from the world, Belle's own crimson orbs looked ahead to see the dead end awaiting him and felt the Minotaurs closing in on him. Another one was dead, and such a young girl at that, and all because the Loki familia didn't get rid of the Minotaurs in time and let them escape into the upper floors. It was always expected for adventurers to always be in danger the moment they set foot in the labyrinth. It was a part of their career to always risk death. That couldn't be argued, and no self-respecting adventurer would try to argue that fact. But it was different for rookie adventurers that just started their career. They were just adjusting to the first few floors and had no idea of the dramatic shift of difficulty and quantity of monsters past the 13th floor. They had no idea and thus were unprepared when a group of Minotaurs came up emerging from the lower levels and start slaughtering them like cattle. The difference in levels was just that huge. The white-haired young man finally stood up, and behind his bangs, Belle's crimson eyes flared. They won't be getting off scot-free for letting this happen, but first, he felt them. Their footsteps had slowed, but were more cautious and steady as they approached him, cornering him in the dead end. Their earlier rage tempered at seeing their target kill one of their brethren in one swipe. Yet they still approached, their shuffling hoof stamping among the dirt, their breathing impatient, and their bloodthirst was almost thick enough to suffocate anyone focused upon by them. Unfortunately, that meant nothing to the white-haired young man before them. His anger towards them and those that caused this incident would have made their bloodthirst pale in comparison. However, that anger soon calmed as Belle let out a breath, and before their eyes, he turned to look over his shoulder, his eyes smoldering. And then, only then, did the Minotaurs instinctively realize that it wasn't the young man that was cornered by them, but it was they who was cornered by something that couldn't be called human. The crimson eyes of their target were flaring, glowing a baleful maroon that was completely unfit to be in the eyes of a human being. They stopped, they froze as their hearts completely stopped beating, their lungs constricted, their bodies halted as their very soul froze in petrified terror as those eyes fell upon them, with all the coldness fit for something that was above them, in terms of being a monster. Before those eyes, they were the prey, they were children, they were the ants before the predator. They could do nothing as an oppressive pressure fell upon their shoulders, causing their knees to buckle and their instinctual driven desires to go wild. Yelling, screaming, roaring with all the desire to just live, to just flee. Flee from this monstrosity. Enough is enough, no more will die here. This is as far as I let this continue. And with a brief flash, Belle's eyes narrowed into smoldering embers while he changed the grip of his knife into a reverse grip. With the blade gleaming, wind beckoned at his unspoken command, molding and shaping along the length of his blade, forming a blade of wind stretching out from the original blade. And then Belle attacked. And then the Minotaurs knew how much of a mistake they made. Oh whoa, hurry. 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 Go. 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 Faster. 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 The wind sped fast all over the 6th floor of the Arario labyrinth. The force and velocity of the wind could be considered to be at the level of a tornado as it sped all over, slaying every Minotaur in its intended path, and those left behind were crushed by a just as fast grey blur. The wind sung sharply as the streaked across the halls and chambers, killing every Minotaur or monster it came across. However, in that windstream of sharp blades and singing gusts of wind, there was a blur of gold that flew with the speed of a fairy. Its long streaks of bright gold mixed in with the turbulent winds made it out to be both breathtakingly beautiful and dangerous to anyone caught in its path. There was no hesitation as it flew, its golden streaks left only monsters exploding into black mist as it covered the 6th floor in speed nigh unmatched by most. Faster. 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 I need to go faster. That mantra was repeated within the mind of the one whom commanded this stream of wind, and the element seemed to beckon her unspoken plea as it sped up even faster, increasing her velocity more and more until she was more than a blur, vanishing in the blink of an eye, killing everything in its path until hold on a second. Suddenly, the wind stopped. Abruptly, the wind halted and unfurled upon itself, with the velocity and speed still in due process. It slammed against the walls of the labyrinth, causing it to crack as it all at once dispersed. Once it did, unveiled within that one speeding bullet of golden wind was something one would not at first expect to be the cause of that unnatural phenomena. Long golden hair flared to the side, whilst equally majestic golden eyes gleamed within a barely noticeable amount of annoyance, not at the source of the voice, but of the situation at hand. It was a young woman, a very beautiful woman with a healthy pale complexion and a slender body, but having a toned physique that spoke of equal measure in immense speed, power and flexibility. The woman wore an attire that was reminiscent to a knight's. However, it consisted of only a metal headband, a chest plate that covered only her shoulders, arms, and upper chest. She had brown leather gloves beneath her armored sleeves, 2 metal plates protecting her wide hips and metal leg plates. Beyond that she wore a blue and blackless outfit that reached barely past her waistline and which covered the underside of her right breast. And held firmly in her right hand was her personal sword of choice. It was of a peculiar design with a metallic crooked-shaped pommel and black leather-wrapped handle and a thick rectangular guard. Strangely coming from the guard and along a quarter length of the blade was another piece of metal that was bent at 90 degrees where at the end had an arrow pointing straight up the blade's length. The blade itself was about 4 foot in length and was double-edged. The young woman was in fact one of the key members of the Loki Familia, one of their strongest and one of the strongest official adventurers sanctioned by the Council of the Gods and Goddesses. This young woman was named Aes Wallenstein, the highly praised sword princess that was highly admired amongst Arario for both her beauty and skill. Her long golden hair and eyes that were like liquid gold set her apart from most others and made her the envy of many women and the target for many males' advances. Yet she held no interest in either, she had a much more desirable goal, and the only way she would reach that goal was to put herself through what's been doing for the past 5 years. Throwing herself into combat to make herself strong, stronger than anyone imaginable. So strong she would reach the precipice that even the gods were wary of, the very same precipice that her goal, her desire stood upon. Turning her gaze onto her fellow Familia member Aes tilted her head to the side in what was almost innocent curiosity or bewilderment. "Why did you tell me to stop, Bet?" She questioned in what was almost a demand, but none could really blame that from her tone of voice, seeing as the situation they were in was very dire. Bet Loga, a part of the Loki Familia stopped by her to catch his breath. He was a young man appearing around 17 or 18 with light grey shaggy hair, which had a pair of dog ears popped up from the messy hair. He had a tanned complexion with a jagged purple tribal mark going down the underside of his left eye, and his amber eyes were narrowed in both annoyance and apprehension. He had a black choker around his neck, a grey jacket with a white fur collar and black pants that went down to his ankles, which was wrapped by a tan leather belt. He also had on a pair of pure white forearm protectors that went all the way up to his elbows and mithril boots that gleamed in the dark labyrinth. Bet scowled as he caught his breath before he spoke. "Be careful, I know we didn't get them all, and Tyan and Tiona already found a few more corpses." He frowned at that, to which Aes's eyes narrowed in a rare flash of anger at herself which was shared by the man. This was their mistake, one caused by their own arrogance and ignorance of the situation prior. Their expedition was traveling back up from the lower levels, only when they came to the 17th floor, they came upon a massive group of minotaurs coming toward, and in a swell of arrogance and pride, they held back most of their power when dealing with the minotaurs just to release some steam, yet this caused them to escape to the upper floors. A mistake they tried to stop, but in the end they all saw the consequences of their actions each time they went up a floor. That adventurers caught off guard are those that were simply unable to fight the minotaurs and were systematically ripped apart by the rampaging monsters. They were reminded of that consequence every time they saw the bodies, and for each death, the weight of their actions weighed heavily upon each of their shoulders. Aes eyed her fellow teammate before she shifted her gaze toward another hallway. "I know, but there is still more, I can feel it in the wind. They are close, and if we can get rid of them now we can avoid more casualties," she said, which caused Bet's scowl to lessen if only to a degree. He knew of her only magical ability, the Tempest Aerial, an ability that allowed her to manipulate the wind into a rushing gale around her body and sword, granting her an armor of wind that allows for her to attain extremely high speeds, and anything that comes into contact with it would be cut apart at the very seams. However, it also granted her a passive susceptible level to feel the wind around her, to feel it and any changes or shift in the wind, which has alerted her and the Familia to surprise attacks on more than one occasion. "I see, but still, while the minotaurs are a problem I can't help but feel something's wrong," he said, his sensitive nose twitching to the peculiar scent around him. His ears twitched ever so slightly while Aes looked at him with a tilt of her head. "What do you mean? What do you sense, Bet?" she asked, which made the half-man half-dog grit his teeth as his amber eyes narrowed even more as his senses flared up. His overly sensitive senses allowed him to feel any abnormalities in the world than most others, and right now he felt something was off. Very off. The goosebumps that were crawling upwards from his legs and arms and the cold chill of dread that was going up his spine only furthered this fact. "I don't know. The air, it feels heavy, but it's more than that, there's something wrong here, Aes. Something is here, something dangerous," he whispered, but Aes caught in, but just as she was about to respond, she suddenly felt what Bet was worried about, only now it made itself apparent throughout the 6th floor. "Soo!" The wind screamed with a fear that was both unholy and yet terrifying enough to cause Aes's soul to freeze. Golden and amber eyes alike both widened as all of a sudden an immense weight fell upon them, crashing down upon their shoulders. It caused their knees to buckle under the strain. But then came the anger that followed flooded the labyrinth like a tsunami, it came down upon them. The anger was immeasurable, it was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe for the two. Sweat poured from their heads as they tried in vain to even remotely move their bodies beneath the magnitude of the pressure and anger falling upon them. What is this? Bet grunted out as used all his power to just himself standing, while Ace, on the other hand, was having an almost equally amount of trouble standing. Yet she pushed herself up even as the alarms in her head rung loud and true. For the third time in her life, Ace felt that cold chill of dread wash over her body. A familiar chill that froze her soul and made her instinctively aware that she was beyond any hope of salvation. She knew this presence. Her eyes widened exceptionally as her body became accustomed to the pressure and the anger that washed over her. Her golden eyes slowly closed as she took hold of this feeling, holding it in her hands before pulling it close. To which her mind's eye flashed to a memory long lost from the depths of her mind. Monsters surrounded her small frame, her fellow adventurers torn apart piece by bloody piece. She was cornered, her body bloody and injured, the color of crimson, her blood was smudged in her normally bright gold hair. Her equally gold eyes wide in petrified terror as the monsters closed in. Then as the monsters made to consume her, in a flash of swirling wind and white-hot burning flames, a cloaked young man came down slaughtering everything in his path. Monsters easily obliterated and reduced to ashes before her eyes. And the form of the black-cloaked individual kneeling before her, his presence was warm yet equally terrifying. His masked visage sending her a visage that tormented her for weeks to come, but beneath that mask, she saw what took hold of her terrified soul and protected her from what was surely to be her demise. Warm crimson orbs stared into her golden eyes for what was like hours, days, weeks, months, years when it was only a short few seconds. Yet in that small time frame she felt the presence of her savior when she looked into his eyes, his warm comforting atmosphere figuratively wrapped around her body like a blanket that would have protected her from even the harshest of times. The comforting leather-gloved hand ruffled her blonde hair, sent waves of warmth coursing through her body, easing her state of terror and calming her fear as she looked upon his cloaked and masked appearance. In that moment, even as he disappeared before her very eyes, even as he faded from her eyes in nothing more than a blur of motion, his eyes of the purest crimson was held steadfast in the very deepest part of her mind, the eyes of the one who saved her life. She would remember those eyes for the rest of her life as his words drifted away as he vanished amongst the confusion. "You're safe now." Her eyes snapped open in shock before Ace stood up, completely surprising Bet before she activated her ability to pick up speed before she flew down, ignorant of the worried shouts of Bet behind her. Everything in her mind was blocked out, nothing mattered to the blonde as she sped toward the source of where she felt the presence. Desperation built up from years of searching fueled her body, repelling the instinctive fear her body felt from the pressure and anger that washed over her. For her soul swelled in bliss for the anticipation of seeing him again. It mattered little to her for she could feel it, beneath that pressure, beneath that anger, she could feel his presence again after so long. That warm atmosphere of the young adventurer who saved her 5 years ago from certain death. The very same whose existence was legendary among Arario and even in the known world. The very same man who granted her the solace in which she always wanted to experience as a child but could never receive until 5 years ago. The one thing her mother had in her father, something she cherished and wanted to feel for herself. A hero. He's here, the one I've been searching for. I wouldn't mistake that presence for anyone else. Her thoughts were rampant as she thought about him. He had saved her from certain death, he had become what her father was to her mother, he came down from like the fairy tales her mother used to read to her all the time, and he saved her like a knight would a princess. But unlike in the stories, he never stayed and vanished from her eyes before her familia found her. Yet there was a certain abnormality as her hero was the very same man who was infamous amongst the gods and goddesses, the very same man whose name was spoken of in both reverence and fear. The man who went under the alias that was placed upon him by the deities from their own caution of him. Her hero, the one she sought day after day whenever she could, despite the thinly veiled attempts by her familia to discontinue her search, was in fact the very same name that was the eternal enemy of the gods in ancient times. Her hero was Diablo. A small smile crossed her features as her body went on autopilot, following after the presence with all the drive she's built up since 5 years ago. She could feel it, closer and closer it came, and the more she closed in the more her smile grew. Her long hair billowed behind her as her eyes caught upon a four-way crossing, but the presence she felt was near. So close that the left. Speeding closer, Ace Wallenstein sped towards the corner to turn on the left. Excitement fueled her slender body as she would finally come face to face with her savior after so long. To finally see him after 5 long years apart, to hopefully hear the words she's wanted to hear from him the moment she set her path to become as strong as she was today. But that reality shattered as she turned the corner and stopped dead on her feet, her eyes widened as the pressure and the anger completely evaporated around her. And what replaced it was a cold atmosphere that saturated the entire 6th floor to the point it brought goosebumps throughout her body. Golden eyes widened slowly as she fully came back to her senses enough to realize there was someone walking past her. The footsteps were light, almost undetectable, but they were there regardless. Slowly, she turned her head to the side, casting her gaze to the right of her body, just in time to see something that made her let out a small gasp of surprise. Golden eyes widened more and more as she looked upon a sight that would paint a picture as to what she could describe as being ethereal, divine, and yet so cold in almost every way imaginable. No one, not even her goddess Loki, gave off such an atmosphere as she looked upon the appearance of the one who stood beside her. The purest of white hair shined brightly amongst the dark caverns of the labyrinth. It was wavy in a sense, but its dark white shade lit up the darkness. Then she took a second to look upon the body of the one who was there. It was a young man that was an inch or two smaller than her. He had low-budget equipment on his body, but as strangely her mind were drawn to the most important aspect of the person before her. It was his eyes, and then she realized for an almost imperceptible second that the eyes of the young man were boring straight into her own. Then the world froze around her as gold met a pair of royal crimson that glowed with a deep inner maroon. Her body shook from the unbidden waves of shock that crashed into every part of her body as she looked into those eyes. Eyes she hadn't forgotten and kept within the depths of her mind. Those were the eyes she remembered, those were his eyes, the eyes of her savior. "El Diablo," her soft-spoken inquiry pierced the cold atmosphere coming off the young man beside her, who, for a fraction of a second, narrowed his glowing crimson eyes before he stared deeper into her golden orbs, before they widened by a margin. But that too vanished into an impassive stare that would have frozen anything if he so wished it. Instead, Ace felt a sudden shift before those beautiful crimson eyes shifted. They morphed as three intricate patterns stretched and made themselves known, but before she could fully realize the unique pattern in those eyes, she heard only one word before her world succumbed to darkness. Sleep. Oh whoa. Elle watched him passively as the young woman before him stilled once he spoke before her golden eyes grew hazy before she started to fall. Her body sagged and she stumbled before he caught her so she didn't fall. Gently he laid her against the wall. And for a small moment he just stared at the young woman before him with an impassive expression. Then he just closed his eyes, cutting off the chakra to his eyes, before he placed his hand on her head and ruffled her gold hair in a slow but comforting gesture. Letting go, he turned around and walked away as he felt the other presence quickly coming to his location, and he made his way out with the Minotaur threat secured. But as he walked away he allowed himself to give a small smile that was masked in the darkness. A chuckle escaped him before he spoke to seemingly himself as a memory from 5 years ago flashed before the forefront of his mind. The memory he had long forgotten, of the girl he saved 5 years ago, of the face of the young girl who stared at him that day with both fear and awe that day. Her golden eyes pierced into his soul that day and left him with a mark he's carried to this very day. His smile grew as he walked on further before his body disappeared into the darkness, but as Belle disappeared his words were carried on along the air before traveling to the unconscious blonde woman. "You've grown up to be very beautiful and very strong, little angel." However, unknown to even Belle at that time, he never saw the small smile form on Ace's angelic features. Her eyes creaked open ever so slightly, only to watch his back as he left her. However, this time she couldn't find it in herself to be disappointed as this time she had seen him, that was him, there was no doubt in her mind now. That had been her savior, that had been the man who saved her life as a child. That was her hero. Finally, a picture of the man who was the epitome of her desires was painted in her mind's eye. Those crimson orbs that she dreamed of finally had a face that belonged with it, even if that face was one of a young man who appeared to be younger than her didn't deter Ace in the slightest. Falling back to sleep peacefully, Ace allowed her smile to grow as she had one last fleeting thought before she fell back under the sway of Belle's spell. "His shadow, it's as eclipsing as ever, you truly are the strongest, aren't you?" Oh whoa. The moment Belle left the labyrinth and turned in the meat for the request after bringing it out with his ability, he had stumbled his way into town, intent on heading to the hostess of fertility, just so he could keep his promise to Eina tonight. She needed the day off, and he was hellbent on giving her a night to relax and let off some steam. Even with the state he was in, he was completely intent on giving her a night of luxury and relaxation. But the events of what happened in the labyrinth left a dark and hazy impression on him. The incident wouldn't be covered up. He was sure Finn, being the man he was, wouldn't dishonor the deaths of those that died because of his subordinates' reckless behavior by trying to cover it up, but would inevitably do all he could to protect his subordinates from severe punishment. He was just that type of person. He was selfless in that, and for that he could respect him. Yet that didn't mean he wouldn't want to see them punished, and by chance the Loki Familia did try to cover it up, he'd step in as his other persona and personally make them evaluate their actions. He wasn't afraid of facing the Familia if it meant protecting the honor of those that couldn't fend for themselves in the labyrinth. Those that died were unable to defend from the Minotaurs and were caught up in the arrogance of Finn's subordinates, so he would crush the Familia and oppose even Loki, should it ever come down to that. While he took priority to become strong so he could protect Hestia and his loved ones, he also held a code to protect those that couldn't protect themselves. Which was why, if by chance the Loki Familia did try to cover up the deaths they caused, he wouldn't hesitate to bring down his full power on them for their sake. Though Hestia would tear into his hide for doing something so outrageous, he just couldn't let those kind of things slide when he could have done something about it. Still, I guess out of the entire incident something good came of it, she really has grown. Bell thought wistfully on the young woman who had come running toward his location. When he slew those minotaurs he had felt her coming and quickly began to seal back his power prematurely. Yet in the end, he underestimated how quickly she would arrive, and in the end she found out about him. How? Because he knew she knew just by the look in her eyes and the fact she muttered his other persona's alias in such a manner. Yet he couldn't really find it in himself to be worried, there was something in her eyes that told him she wouldn't spill his secret to anyone. However, it was also in those eyes that told him she was actively seeking him out, which answered his own question as to who was looking for him so fervently for all these years. He now had a name and the appearance of the one who wanted to see him so much, but he never thought it would be the girl he saved when he was 10 years old. She had really grown up from the little pipsqueak who couldn't have even reached his chest at the time. He could just look at her and realize she had grown not only very beautiful, but also very very strong, because that girl he saved turned out to become renowned sword princess of the Loki Familia, Ace Wallenstein. What were the odds? His red eyes lit up for a moment when he saw the hostess of fertility coming in sight, and he allowed a small smile to grace his features when he saw the familiar form of Eina standing by the entrance. But just as he was about to greet her, crack. Suddenly, Bell grimaced and grit his teeth as another surge of his power lashed out within his body, tearing and ripping away within him. This was the consequence of letting out a bit of his power without unlocking the seals he placed on his own power. It was a forced output of his power, and to prematurely lock it away when Ace was coming toward him had caused a backlash on his own body. Though he hid it well, the fact of the matter was, Bell had a lot of power, more than most could comprehend, which was why such power lashed out against his body and would tear into his muscles and bones if treated in such a manner. This was his consequence, and yet even as his muscles tore and his bones cracked under the pressure, he still kept a straight leveled expression. Even if each step he took felt like he was walking through an ocean of lava, he would not allow himself to show any amount of pain in front of Eina right now. This was her night, and he would not allow himself to show any pain in front of her. "Hey Eina-chan," he called out, leveling out his posture as he made his way toward her, and for a moment he took in her appearance with an appreciative gaze. The young woman was only showing why he found her natural beauty to be so appealing, as she wore casual clothing consisting of a light yellow long-sleeved shirt that was opened up with a frilled top around her neck and chest, allowing for a bit of cleavage to show, though not blaringly so. Then she had on a red miniskirt that went down just a few inches below her waist. On her legs she wore black stockings that reached all the way up her long legs until they stopped about halfway to reaching her skirt, and on her feet she wore what looked to be brown dress shoes. Overall, Eina in casual clothes was a welcome change to Bell, and for a moment he completely forgot about the pain his body was in as his cheeks flushed slightly at her appearance. Wow. Apparently Eina heard him as she turned to him with a nervous and embarrassed flush, but her smile was matched only by the sun itself in its warmth. Her emerald eyes sparkled when she looked at him, and for one reason or another he felt his heart do a flip at the sight of her. Zeus help him, why did Eina have to be so gorgeous? Ah, Bell-kun. Her voice was like a melody that soothed his aching body, and he let out a sigh as he approached her. Beforehand he had cleaned himself up as best he could before he made his way here, only he disregarded his jacket back at the church. This left him with only his long-sleeved black t-shirt, black pants, brown belt and his boots. While strapped ever presently was his knife on his left hip, but overall, Bell felt a certain satisfaction that even in his sealed form, he could appear to be somewhat appealing, if Eina's appreciative gaze was anything to go by. "Glad to see Misha passed on my message, seeing as you came Eina, and I gotta say you look really dazzling." He had to comment, causing her to let out a small giggle, yet her blush grew darker from his comment, but the rare playful smile that came upon her features, that only enhanced her appearance, made his stomach do a spin. "You don't look so bad yourself, Bell-kun," she said, causing his own cheeks to darken. "Ah shit. Yeah thanks, so shall we go in?" he asked, to which she gave a nod, and she walked inside firstly, followed closely behind Bell. But as they were reaching the counter, Eina's eyes discreetly went to Bell's side, and for a moment she gazed at him until a soft smile graced her face. Her emerald eyes closed in content as she surprised the white-haired young man when she grabbed his hand in her own, causing his cheeks to darken. "I may have mistook what he said before, but now after Misha's encouragement and the fact that I'm here with him, I'm gonna enjoy this for all I can." The half-breed's cheeks flushed scarlet as she pulled Bell alongside her, missing his wince and ignoring his feeble attempts to make her let go. And the warmth she felt coursing through his hand and into her body only made her smile grew as she squeezed his hand just a tad tighter. It was time to have fun. Oh whoa, it was time. That was the thought of Hestia, the goddesses of the hearth and family. Her deep blue eyes stared down at the scroll in her hands, a message sent to her like with every god residing in Arario. The letter was in fine print, an invitation to what was Ganesha's annual feast he had every year just before every monsterphilia every year. It was a feast that was for the gods and goddesses them alone. It was a place where they could relax, unwind and speak with their fellow deities without any restrictions or formalities with their familiars present. But this one was different because in the letter, at the very bottom held the insignia of their homeworld, the heavens with the sun coming over the horizon. It was the sign of what was also being held at the party for those select few that received the emblem in the first place. The gods' council was about to take place, the meeting between the deities who held major power amongst the heavens. A council of only a rare select few deities could attend, one that decided the fate of many happenings in the lower world. It was a meeting that was held only every 5 years, and the last meeting had been all about hunting down her beloved Bel, slandering him with the alias that was the name of their worst enemy in the world. TSK. For a moment, in the darkness of her and Bel's humble little abode, Hestia's long black hair flashed bright red as her control over her godly powers slipped. Her bright blue eyes gained an ethereal glow as her expression morphed into a deep scowl as her energy incinerated the scroll into nothing but ash. Her body flashed, her anger spiking as she thought about her fellow god's attitude toward her one and only familia dependent and the target of her affections. For years Bel had done everything in his power to ensure she was protected, well fed and gave her anything she wanted. He wiped away her debt to her fellow deities and continued to support her and pull her out of trouble. He had sworn himself to her, both body and soul, and for that there was little she could offer in exchange for such loyalty, for such admiration. He took care of her, stayed by her side whenever she wanted him to. He was always there, with her heart in his hands, and for that love she held for him, she could not allow this to continue. She could not allow her fellow deities to treat Bel, the man she loved with all her being, like this anymore. It was one thing to give him the alias as Diablo because she personally found it appealing to his character. But this time, it was clear of what they wanted to do to him. And she would not allow that. So, they're gonna try and lock up Bel-kun, Well, I think it's about time I stopped letting them do what they please. Hestia spoke with a voice that was so unlike her. It was cold, unforgiving, but after what they've done to Bel, she could find no ounce of mercy in her to give to her fellow deities. If they wanted to continue pursuing Bel and potentially hurt him or those around him, then by her power over the heavens, she would remind them why only her brother, Zeus, could stand against her. Chapter 3. The Winds of Change. Bel had to admit something, to concede upon himself a revelation that he's just recently come to be aware of. It was a truth that, well, it wasn't world-breaking, it was just enough to alter his view ever so slightly on a certain someone that's been a part of his life for a while now. Someone that's been his friend for years and supported him, though she had no idea she was supporting a rogue adventurer that the gods themselves were wary of. Now you all may be wondering what that truth may be, and I'll tell you. Bel had just come to realize that Eina, his personal guild advisor and a friend of his for the past 6 years, could not hold her liquor. Meaning she was a horrible lightweight. That was pretty much evident from the way he watched her from his seat as she slurred her words into almost incomprehensible syllables and phrases that made you wonder what she was trying to say. His eyes glinted in amusement from the way her cheeks flushed and her clothing long since ruffled as she joked about something with the head of the inn, Mia Grand. Which the giant dwarven woman seemed to find funny as she let out another bellowing laugh as she brought in another mug for the young woman. Still, this is exactly what she needed. This was his gift to her. Lately he'd come to realize he hadn't been spending as much as time as he wanted with her. She was one among little circle of friends, and he wanted to give Eina some time to herself. As Diablo, he had a peculiar respectful relationship with Oranos and Eina's boss, primordial, the head of the guild that worked directly under Oranos himself. So, all he needed to do was pull some strings, and he could give Eina time to relax. Especially since Royman, the old elf, owed him more than a couple of favors. For a moment, Bel tore his gaze off Eina and let his eyes wash over the other denizens of the hostess of fertility that had come by tonight. To drink, to feast and to mostly have a grandiose time. Most of them were adventurers that had come back from the Labyrinth and needed some much-needed nourishment. Others were citizens of Arario that just wanted to have some fun and get away from their mundane jobs. It was an expectant sight to see for him, as he was someone who had been coming to this little pub for years now, and he had grown to seeing this. The atmosphere of the inn was just perfect in a sense, as it eased the stress for adventurers after a long day of adventuring. It had that feeling of being welcomed, no matter who you were, and that was the kind of atmosphere anyone could enjoy. He himself knew that for a fact as Hestia had been the one to bring him here for the first time. Though she may have regretted that now as this was where he came to know 2 more of his close friends. It never changes here, does it? He spoke to himself, that is before he heard a giggle, and he turned to see a young woman standing beside him. How he didn't sense her was a mystery to him, but he had grown used to that peculiar mystery and instead he focused on the woman before him. I hope you don't mean that in a bad way, Belle-kun, otherwise Ryu-chan and I may start to think you don't want to see us anymore. The young woman stated, her tone full of mirth, but there was no bite in her tone. At her words, Belle freely expressed a true smile toward her as he took in her appearance with his eyes. Sir Flova, a human girl that was one of the 2 friends he made here at the inn, his eyes took in her bluish-gray hair that was tied up in a small knot that turned into a ponytail. She had a milky white and smooth complexion and a maturing womanly body that could be clearly seen even from the waitress dress she wore. But the most interesting part he found in Sir were her eyes. Being one with a peculiar set of eyes himself, he strangely felt drawn to her eyes, which from one glance, had the same shade as her hair, but to him there was more to those eyes than at first glance. He wasn't certain, but it made him curious, and from that curiosity grew an interest that he found in her eyes. Some would say the eyes were the windows to the soul, and that saying would be true for most part. Yet when he looked into Sir's eyes, he always found himself staring into an everlasting sea of grey that blocked his vision from seeing what lay within. But that wasn't the only part of her he admired. Sir Flova was a very cheerful, kind young woman. No one would argue that fact, but he had learned from personal experience on more than a few occasions that she was mischievous and at very rare times extremely scary. And she could, would and will at every opportunity tease him until he's blushing flustered mess. Something that he found to be similar to how Hestia would tease him. But beyond all that, he knew without a doubt of one thing, and that was the fact Sir was very kind and generous to anyone she met. I should know, she was quite stubborn in making me open up when Hestia first brought me here. She was still a kid back then, but she was as stubborn back then as she is now. The thought brought a smile to his face as he turned to stare into her eyes. Addressing her with an expression of warmth that he gave only to his true friends. I would never think of that, Sir-chan. He said semi-seriously and half-jokingly, which she took into consideration before giggling again. Though their eyes remained in contact with one another, the devotion to her and Ryu, to his friends, was clear to Sir. He meant every word and more. Sir, Ryu, Eina and Hestia were his friends, and he would never betray that friendship. He'd sooner take his own life than to even think of breaking that bond he shared with them. After a moment, Sir blushed prettily and averted her gaze as she gripped to him of her leaf green skirt. Biting her lower lip, she gave a small nod. I know I was just joking, Belle-kun. Her words were soft, but he heard her and content with her, knowing that one absolute truth, he began to turn back to the counter. Only see a platter of food and his mug of alcohol being refilled by a slender hand from over the counter. And he only needed to look up to see a sight that only made his smile grow. You're the enemy of women everywhere, Belle-san. Spoke a cool and tempered voice of the only woman that Belle knew could remain so balanced even in this time of atmosphere. And he looked up to see another woman, though she was a few years older than himself and Sir. His crimson orbs took in the appearance of an elf woman with a slender body with light green hair that reached just past her neckline. She had a healthy pale skin tone which only seemed to bring out bright blue eyes. Like Sir, she wore a waitress uniform, fit for the waitresses that worked at the Hostess of Fertility. This was Ryu Lion, his other friend that worked at the Hostess of Fertility, a friend he made in her at the same time he met Sir. She was the silent, stoic type, while Sir was the shy yet stubborn one. Yet as Belle looked at her, he could only see her as another beautiful woman that seemed to be a constant in his rather young life. While Sir was a natural, kind-hearted yet mischievous woman, Ryu was the emotionally balanced and mentally mature one that always seemed to know when he was troubled by something. She was also the one he needed to be on guard around most of the time. While she may try to hide it, Ryu-chan's eyes always seemed to be observing me. I wonder if she was an adventurer once. He thought to himself. He didn't know as much as he would have liked about Ryu, but one thing he caught on from her was that he was always very observant, especially on him, which was why he kept himself guarded when she had that glint in her eyes. Which she had now. What do you mean by that, Ryu-chan? Honestly, he had no clue as to what she meant by that, and he missed the expression Sir had once he said that. He was too innocently unaware of that fact that he was too honest about his goals with those he called friends. His resolve and devotion to them, and only them, was a big factor to their relationship with him. He was, unlike most men, unafraid to show how much he cared for them or any of his friends, and wouldn't hesitate to come to their aid, no matter how much of a problem it would be for him. And that kind of revelation, it was no wonder why Ryu said that to Belle, but unfortunately that flew completely over his head. Ryu just let out a sigh before offering a small smile to the red-eyed young man, which was a rarity itself. It's nothing to be concerned of right now, you'll understand later, I'm sure. She said, giving Sir a small glance causing her break out in an amused chuckle. All the while Belle, the poor oblivious young man that he was, didn't understand why Ryu was giving him that strange smile, and or why Sir was laughing like that. Scratching his head in mild bewilderment, he shrugged before partaking in his food and drink. Oh well, I guess you're right. He took notice of the fact that Sir took a seat beside him while Ryu busied herself by cleaning mugs from the other customers, but remained where she was. All the while her piercing blue eyes trained on him the whole time, which made him feel slightly uncomfortable from how intense her gaze was. It was more intense than it usually was. But just as he was about to take a sip from his mug, he felt a weight fall on his right shoulder and then a pair of slender arms wrapped around his neck. Then a pair of soft breasts was pushed into his shoulder. The softness caused him to freeze as the sensual feeling left him more than a little surprised. And then the smell of alcohol became very evident and he only had to look at his right to see cause of it. It was a sight that would have made him bust out laughing if he wasn't so worried. It was Eina Tull. Her cheeks were flushed the darkest red he'd ever seen and her emerald eyes were glazed over. Every labored breath she took was thick with the smell of alcohol and her body was shaking, thrumming with a sense of emotion that was so intense that he hadn't seen from her. Ever. It was an emotion he knew all too well. He saw it at times in Hestia when she looked at him and at times he felt when looking at Hestia. It was desire, complete and raw desire in its most basest form. Desire glinted in her eyes, unabashed and completely overtaken, the raw sensual emotional thrum throughout her drunken body. From the way she embraced him, the way her body trembled against in his own, the way every breath she took made his own deeply locked desire lash out against its cage. His eyes widened in alarm when he felt his fingers begin twitching and his already disturbed body begin to react to Eina's overly drunken action. "Belkan," she whispered sensually into his ear and Bell felt his face color and his red eyes widened even more in surprise. "Ah. Eina-san. Calm down, you're drunk." Sir stepped in after shaking herself from her stunned state. "Bless you, Sir-chan, bless your soul." Eina though seemed just aware enough of her surroundings to look at Sir, but in her drunken stupor, she pouted like a small child and promptly pulled Bell's face into her bosom, causing his eyes to widen widely in shock. His arms flayed about in the air as the woman pushed his face deeper into her valley of soft perky pillows. No shit, I'm losing myself, Bell thought to himself. No. Hick. Belkan's my, however consciousness slipped in between her fingers and her eyes grew heavy before she slumped forward. Her body falling against Bell completely, which resulted in them both crashing into the floor, but the sound was drowned out by the other customers in the inn. Still, Eina's hair flared out as she fell on top of Bell. His face was still buried in her bosom. HMMM. His arms flailed around wildly, all the while he did everything he could to not scream bloody murder. Oh god, the pain. I didn't think I'd be in this much pain. He definitely underestimated how much damage his body was undergoing, especially since he'd been trying his best to keep the damage his body was degrading into from everyone's eyes. Yet when Eina fell on him and brought him to the floor, that simple action alone made it feel like his body was being torn apart piece by piece, flesh by flesh, bone by bone. Only to be fixed up again and the process starting again and again and again. The pain, oh Kami, the pain. Thankfully, he quickly got a hold of himself and grit his teeth as he took hold of the unconscious Eina and held her up, allowing him to pull himself up from the floor. His bones screamed in protest at the action alone, but he ignored it and pushed away the pain and the degradation of his body into the farthest depths of his mind as he stood up. Picking up Eina, he turned toward the worried and surprised eyes of Sir and Ryu, to which he spoke. "See, can she use one of your rooms for tonight? I don't think she'll be waking up anytime soon," he said in a veiled expression of amused exasperation. Thankfully he received a nod from them. Bless their souls. "Oh whoa, thanks for doing this, Mia-san." Bell thanked the dwarven woman one last time, to which she just waved him off with an easygoing grin. "Oh no worries kid, it's well worth it after seeing little Eina finally unwind like that. Now go on and get some rest, you've paid your bill, so head on home. Me and the girls will take care of Eina." The woman spoke, causing Bell to smile. With a small glance at the sleeping Eina in one of the beds in the dormitory of the inn, he grasped the doorknob and closed the door behind him. Then he let out a sigh as he leaned his head against the doorframe. The events of tonight slowly began to weigh on his shoulders, and despite what happened with Eina, he could still say it was a fun night for him too. It was a night of which he actually needed. He'd been adventuring for so long now that he almost forgot what it meant to relax himself. However, his eyes narrowed when his body began to shake, and with all the resolve built up over the years, he willed his body to calm itself. Contrary to what he looked on the outside, on the inside his body was still going through excruciating amounts of pain. So much pain that he was sure he broke a molar from gritting his teeth so hard. The taste of copper was evident in his mouth, but he ignored it for the most part as he let out a slow leveled out breath. Trying to calm himself from the pain that he was earlier under the impression would have settled by now. "Are you alright, Bell-san?" It took everything Bell had not to jump alarm. With all his senses focused on suppressing his internal pain from exploding, he hadn't sensed a presence that was near him until it made itself known. Slowly he inhaled and exhaled once again before he pulled himself from the door and glanced to his right to see Ryu gazing at him with her usual stoic expression, but there was a spark of worry in those blue eyes. That alone made him straighter in a thinly veiled attempt to appear just fine. Yes, is something wrong, Ryu-chan? He questioned the elf woman whose eyes seemed to narrow in suspicion before she stepped closer toward him. You're trembling. I've been meaning to ask this, but you've been trembling the moment you came to the pub. But now it's gotten worse, she commented as she came closer to him. He so tried to hide the flinch when she laid her slender hand on his shoulder. And he grimaced when he saw her eyes widen in alarm. That alarm only grew into worry when she felt him flinch against her touch, and the way his trembling only got worse. You're in pain, she breathed out before her eyes cut across to him, and Bell merely closed his eyes and hid his obvious agonizing pain behind a small grin. Turning away and quickly walking to the stairs, he spoke. It's nothing, Ryu-chan, I just need some sleep is all. You and Sir-chan get some sleep as well. I'll see you later, I promise. And with his piece said he ran down the stairs with a pained expression, causing him to miss Ryu's expression of horrified shock as she watched him go. The realization came dawning upon her as she looked back down at her hand, the same hand she placed on Bell, only to feel the lasting contact she made with him. She was an elf, a child of nature itself, and thus she was very sensitive to the energies of the world and in other people. Which was why the moment she touched Bell she felt a link between herself and him form, and in that link she felt what was causing him so much pain. And it took all her years of self-control to not let out a cry of terrified shock. Power, so much power. No, she thought with horrific realization, her hand tingled in barely suppressed pain, the lingering energy she felt from Bell coursed itself through her hand, causing it to burn and tingle slightly. Her eyes narrowed in worry for the young man that fled as she hid her hand away behind her skirt. That was too much power, that sheer amount of power, it was almost like I was drowning in it. And it was building, expanding. Bell-san's body, it was burning. Was he going through that the entire time he came here? Her hand went to her heart as she thought about that. The thought alone pained her greatly, thinking that he was going through so much pain before her eyes and having little to no idea until now. To know the boy who befriended her years ago was going through that amount of pain right under her nose. Why was he hiding it? Bell, she let out his name for the first time without any suffix to his name. Her worry for him became dominant as she looked back to where she watched him go. For Bell, as he went down the stairs and saw the door leading outside, he all but jumped toward it, causing it to snap open as he hurled himself out of the pub. But as he stumbled down the few stairs from the pub's entrance, he let out a hiss as the pain grew more fierce. His body thrummed and pulsed with his power, restrained as it was, and he let out a pained gasp as he almost fell to a knee. Why hasn't the pain vanished? What's going on? Stumbling forward, Bell bit his lip as he stalked away from the pub, gripping his body for all it was worth. Trying to hold on to the power in his body that threatened to slip through the cracks of his fleeing control. And as he walked away, he never accounted for the young woman, sir, watching him go as she leaned against the building she worked in. Her gray eyes watched him go with a sorrow-filled light, and an expression of anguish formed upon her face. In light of watching him, Bell, the man of her affections, walk away in such obvious tormenting pain, Sir Flova's eyes closed in grief. Her hands gripped at the hem of her shirt as she turned and walked away from the pub, entering the alleyway. Sir opened her eyes again, only to show her once grey eyes had melded away into a royal purple that glinted with a power that was otherworldly, and yet the pain in those eyes were true. Pain from the heart, sorrow from the soul, anguish from the love she harbored for the young man that walked away from the pub, from her. Bell, I knew it had to be you, but why must you be in so much pain? Oh whoa. At this point, Bell was sure no one knew what true pain was like better than he did at this very moment. With each step he took, his body was literally bursting, his bones broke and regenerated at the same pace. His clothes tore at the seams as his body exploded with his breath he took, blood spewed from various parts of his body. With each pained gasp of air, his power, his natural-born energy, his chakra slipped from the cracks of his control. By the moment he reached the church, his body was soaked in crimson, each footstep left behind a bloody footprint, blood poured from his body that was tearing itself apart to restrain the power within him. His once pure white hair was darkening into a rusty red from the blood pouring from his scalp. What's happening to me? This isn't supposed to be happening. This should have stopped long ago. Hestia, I need Hestia. That was the sole driving force that kept him from falling at this point. He knew without a shadow of a doubt Hestia would know what was wrong with him and would be able to heal him. At first he thought this was just a consequence of releasing a bit of his power prematurely at the labyrinth earlier today, but now the pains only grown to such a degree that it was tearing his body apart. He tried to seal it in the labyrinth earlier, but had something gone wrong? Why was his power breaking out? He locked it away for that very reason. The red life-giving liquid dripped from his body as opened the door to the church, and once it closed behind him, Bell didn't have time to even call for Hestia as he lost all self-control and fell to his knees as another wave of mind-numbing pain surged forth in the form of another pulse. He gasped, but as his hands fell to the floor his eyes widened as yet another pulse, many times stronger, escaped his body. Then Bell screamed. Eina. In a horrific display of gore, blood exploded from his body again, painting the church's inner walls crimson, tainting the cross in front of him red with his blood. In that instant, Bell lost consciousness and his body fell face first to the floor. If one were to even look at his body now, they would have wretched after seeing his back and chest blown out by some unseen force. His open eyes, wide in shock, were gone, and his mouth was in the form of a perpetual scream of agony. Then what followed was a wave of pure jet black darkness that leaked out from his torn and broken body. It took on the form of a black void of nothingness, a misty black that leaked off his body before it seemed to latch onto his body. The light of the moon itself was snuffed out by the darkness that came out from the boy's body before it took hold of the seemingly dead young boy and wrapped itself around him. Slowly, the darkness seeped back into the boy's flesh, causing the wounds on his person to instantly regenerate at a speed that was far faster than normal. His blown-out chest grew back, his lungs and heart regenerated back, and his bones came back in the span of a second. For all intents and purposes, Bell looked perfectly fine now. However, purple tattoos began to thrum to life all across his arms, legs, and chest, each having the design of a flame-like marking that thrummed with a power that was far too alien to ever be conceived in this world. They grew and stretched among his body like a second skin, going up his waist and shoulders, spanning his chest and up his neck, before the markings finally reached his face. Then Bell's wide eyes flashed, and a pair of maroon orbs with a ripple-like pattern appeared over the full scope of his eyeballs, but then a comma began to appear over each ring that overlapped each other until there was a total of 9 commas. Those dual abnormally otherworldly eyes unconsciously spun in a hypnotizing manner that seemed to carry a life of their own before the pattern vanished, revealing only crimson orbs with no light of consciousness in them. Then the tattoos vanished as well, as if they were never there to begin with. Then Bell's eyelids closed to the world. And then darkness greeted him like a long-lost sun. No one would ever be the wiser of a humanoid figure of pure blackness watching over Bell's unconscious form. It stood with the physique of a man, but it was an entity of void less black that even when standing on the rooftop, watching from the hole in the ceiling, that even the moon's brilliant radiance could not even reveal its appearance. For it had none at all. The thing's shoulders trembled in what seemed like quiet laughter, as if the entity found what it had seen to be an amusing spectacle. Its laughter held no emotion though, no life, no death, no soul whatsoever. It was a hollow chuckle, one fit for an entity such as itself. Finally you start to amuse me, child. I suppose you aren't a complete failure as I once imagined. The figure crouched low, staring aimlessly at the prone body of Bell with no eyes, but it was still staring down at the unconscious young man, as if it could see him, through him, and read his complete soul bare, as if it were an open book to it. And it was. Yes, he's continue this little show, boy. Show me, prove to me that you aren't an utter failure like the rest of these wretches. With the things P said, it just vanished. No smoke, no display of power, no wisp of wind, no nothing. It just vanished. All the while Bell would remain oblivious about the letter left behind in his and Hestia's room. An hour passed, and in the midnight sky under the light of the moon, the church's door slowly creaked open to reveal the physique of another man whom. The man stopped once he saw all the blood around the church's interior, and a low whistle escaped the man. "Ooh, this explains the blood I saw earlier," he said in a grim acknowledgement before turning his shadowed gaze upon the prone form of Bell in the center of the church's floor. With a somber silence the man walked toward him before coming to the young man's side. And soon his appearance was revealed to be a young man wearing an attire consisting of what would be mostly Western with a cowboy hat that covered his naturally curly sandy blonde hair. The distinct feature he had was a pure white feather which was stuck into the fabric of his hat. Well, old man Zeus wasn't kidding when he said it wouldn't be pretty when I found you. However, I didn't think you would be this banged up kid. The man spoke before a content smile crossed his features. Oh well, at least I found you before the others did, now up you go. With a small grunt of effort the man lifted the young Bell onto his shoulder, and with a brief flash of white the man vanished with the unconscious Bell. Oh whoa, there was an unspoken rule among the gods and goddesses, an unofficial law that many had to follow, lest they risk damnation upon themselves. It was a rule that no one had dared to tread upon, as the consequences of such a foolish action were very real, and were very terrifying for any foolish deity that did such an idiotic thing. And that was to cross a certain goddess, a goddess that many overlooked due to her rather young appearance, but time and time again vastly underestimated the sheer magnitude of power she wielded among the 7 heavens. This goddess was one that was for the majority of her very being a compassionate and loving woman to anyone. She was a kind, pure soul at heart. Yet when spited, she was one of the most dangerous entities to ever grace the heavens. In her wrath chaos would follow, in her hands, even others' gods fell before her, as she has proven time and time again. Those that truly earned her fury would never have time to even apologize, as she would bring down upon them a fury that nigh any deity would ever imagine. The only ones who learned early on about this was her close friends and her siblings that knew about her true power. She was a goddess that was not as well known as others on earth, but in the heavens her very name was like speaking of a nightmare come to life. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth, the exemplar of the governing figure of family. She loved family. Family is what she always wanted, it is what she has always wanted to have even in her youth with her siblings. Yet she could never have such a thing, for most of her siblings were either pompous fools, idiots with an ego the size of the earth, a pervert that had the libido the size of the galaxy, and an absolute airhead. Her siblings never knew the value of family, and for the longest amount of time she wondered if she would have such a thing. Yet in just a few short years in what was her long life, Hestia had finally found her family. She had found her family in the form of a young boy who grew up to become a man. A man that would become something more, something that she herself would never have dreamed of becoming until a few years earlier. She had found a family in the man she loved with all of her soul. Hestia loved Bel with all of her being, her heart was always in his hands. He was her family, and in him she loved him and wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. She loved everything about that man, his compassion for her, his devotion to her and his small circle of friends. His willingness to go above and beyond the realms of what was possible just to support her. His resolve to protect her through whatever was thrown at them. Hestia knew she had it bad, very bad for Bel Tsutsuki, but she didn't care as she loved him. From the moment she found the young boy in the alleyways of Arario until now. She had fallen head over heels for him in such a manner that even Aphrodite herself would have been jealous by her sheer unquestioning love she had for him, and only him. However, there was one thing she wanted from him, a selfish desire really, but of all the things he has done for her, the one thing she truly wanted from Bel was his love, and if possible maybe just maybe have a family with him to love, and to be loved in return, to have children with him. To always be in his arms was her dream. And yet the love of her immortal life was being threatened by her fellow deities. The line between self-control and going on a murderous rampage was becoming increasingly blurry to Hestia as she stalked towards the gods' council chambers. Her blue eyes were unusually cold, colder than the very void itself. Even the sounds of the party Ganesha was throwing below the temple did little to affect her temperamental state. Truly, the only thing that could quell Hestia's anger, that built upon by years of watching her love be slandered by overly cautious gods and goddesses, was Bel himself. Yet he was not there to stop her. It would take a miracle for her to come out of this meeting this time without tearing most of her fellow deities apart. Once Hestia reached the doors that led inside the council chambers, she stopped and took a deep breath before she exhaled. Closing her eyes, she let her thoughts go to the love of her life and of all the slander he suffered by the hands of the deities in this very room. To have to undergo a double life to protect her and his friends from them and his potential enemies. To have been given the alias of the very entity that long ago had been the nemesis of the gods themselves. An image of Bel's smiling visage materialized in her mind, and a small smile made its way onto her face, and she placed a hand over her heart which thrummed lightly at the image of her dearly beloved. "Bel, give me some of your resolve so I don't lose myself in this." With her resolve renewed if ever so slightly, Hestia's expression was hidden behind a facade of her usual happy-go-lucky personality. With a reignited fire she placed her hands on the doors and went on in. She would have no idea of the change that would come about this meeting. What if Naruto was primordial god in danmachi? Thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.